She was 21 and hollow. No room. No mother. No place where her name was spoken kindly. Just a pocket screwdriver set and $7 she had kept folded inside the lining of her torn jacket. And with that $7, she bought a condemned camera repair shop on a narrow street in Bisbee, Cochise County, Arizona, a cliff town that had nearly fallen off county maps by 1975. Rain came through one back corner of the roof. The front windows were white with dust and cracked like dry skin. The county had said the building had been closed since 1998 and was scheduled for demolition the following winter. But what nobody knew was that inside the bellows of a mahogany view camera fixed to its wooden stand, in a sealed compartment that had not been opened in over 60 years, was $50,000, unprocessed film, and something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Stella Marie Voss had been leaving her whole life without knowing it. Long before she understood rent notices or bus schedules or the smell of wet cardboard, she understood the particular silence that settled over a house when adults had stopped telling the truth. It came down the hallway before a person did. It stood in doorways. It waited at the kitchen table with a glass of iced tea sweating rings into the wood, while the refrigerator hummed with the patient endurance of machines that are never asked what they have heard. She was born in Tucson in the late summer, when the heat lay on the roofs like a hand and the streets gave back the sun long after dark. Her birth certificate said Stella because her mother had once liked the sound of stars, and Marie because that had belonged to a grandmother nobody mentioned unless there was a funeral or a box to be sorted. The name Voss came from her mother's side, from people who had carried hand tools across state lines and believed a thing was worth saving if the hinges still answered. As a child, Stella was narrow-shouldered, watchful, and exact with her hands. She did not break toys by accident. She took them apart and lined the pieces on a towel. Screws above springs, springs above wheels, wheels above the hollow plastic body that had hidden them. Other children tore paper from birthday gifts and shrieked over color. Stella turned the boxes over to see how the tabs had been folded. She liked hinges, clasps, latches, anything that promised there was a deliberate way in and a deliberate way out. Her mother, Mary Ann, used to call that habit cold. She did not always say it unkindly. In the early years, there were mornings when Mary Ann stood barefoot at the stove, singing under her breath while pancake batter made pale circles on the iron pan. She had brown hair then, worn loose, and a red cotton robe with one sleeve always sliding down her arm. She could be sweet in those mornings, full of soft instructions and sudden kisses pressed to the crown of Stella's head. But sweetness in Mary Ann had no root. It came like rain over Kalish, bright for a moment, gone before it could sink. Stella's first father was a photograph on top of a dresser, face turned toward the sun, one hand lifted as though he had been caught leaving. His name was Thomas Reed, and he had worked construction outside Mesa before a scaffolding fall took him when Stella was too young to remember the sound of his walk. Mary Ann kept his photograph for several years, not because grief held her, but because removing it would have required an explanation she did not want to give. When Stella was 6, the photograph disappeared into a drawer. When she was 8, the drawer was emptied. By then Mary Ann had begun measuring life by whoever might rescue her from it. There was a man with a blue truck who brought groceries twice and vanished. There was a salesman who smelled of wintergreen and spoke too loudly over dinner. There was a soft-handed church musician who lasted through Easter and left behind a box of cassette tapes. Stella learned early that men could take up space in a room even when they were not permanent. She learned not to grow attached to footsteps. The one person who stayed with any kind of steadiness was her grandfather, Elias Voss. Marianne's father, though Marianne used the word father as if it were a splinter she refused to pull. Elias lived in a weather-stained duplex on the south side of Tucson, behind a chain-link fence silvered by age and sun. The place smelled of machine oil, orange peels, coffee, and the dry dust that settled on everything in Arizona, no matter how carefully a person swept. Every Saturday, unless Marianne decided otherwise, Stella was dropped at his gate just after 8 in the morning. Elias would be waiting in a white undershirt beneath a khaki work shirt, his cuffs rolled evenly, his gray hair combed straight back with water. He had a face made of planes and patience, the kind of face that had spent more years looking closely than speaking quickly. On the porch beside his chair sat a wooden case with brass corners. Inside the case were screwdrivers with blackened handles, curved tweezers, lens spanners, calipers, a bulb blower, small tins of screws, and envelopes labeled in a hand so neat it seemed almost engraved. Shutter leaves, retaining rings, brass washers. Leica, cracked. Kodak, salvage. Graflex, no hurry. No hurry was how Elias Voss lived. He had repaired cameras for 42 years, first in Phoenix, then Bisbee, then Tucson, after the trade thinned out and people began throwing away what had once been kept. He knew the temper of metal springs by touch. He could hear whether a shutter dragged by 1/10 of a second, not from magic, but from decades of listening to the difference between a clean click and a tired one. He taught Stella that oil was not generosity. Too much of it gathered dust and ruined a mechanism more surely than neglect. Their ritual never changed unless rain came hard enough to flood the street. First, he made coffee for himself and weak tea for her, with honey stirred until the spoon rang twice against the glass. Then he set a towel across the table. White for dark parts, dark for silver. A divided tray waited to the left, empty envelopes to the right, and a notebook open in the middle. Before you touch, he said every week, look until the thing starts telling you how it was made. He never hurried her. He let her sit with a broken Ansco, a box brownie, a German rangefinder whose leatherette had peeled up at the corners like burned paper. He showed her how to cup a hand over a screw so it could not leap away, how to loosen a ring without scratching glass, how to breathe out before lifting a shutter blade with tweezers, how to use the pad of a finger, not the nail, when testing ground edges. At 10, Stella cleaned her first aperture assembly. At 12, she learned that balsam separation looked like a pale ghost blooming between elements. At 13, she polished a lens with cerium oxide under Elias's careful eye, slow circles on a wetted felt pad, never bearing down, never chasing perfection past the point where glass could forgive her. At 14, she could set a mechanical shutter by ear well enough that Elias stopped correcting her and merely listened with his head tilted. There were long afternoons when the desert heat held the windows shut and the table fan moved the smell of oil and tea back and forth across the room. Stella would sit with her feet tucked under the chair, sleeve rolled above her wrist, eyes lowered, while Elias told her about the people who once came to a repair counter carrying cameras wrapped in towels as though they were injured birds. A ranch wife from Wilcox with dust inside the lens after a sandstorm. A copper miner with a folding Kodak that held the only photograph of his brother. A widow from Naco who brought a cracked portrait lens and said she could not afford repair, only to have Elias fix it anyway because her hands shook when she opened the purse. He did not speak of charity as a virtue. He spoke of it as maintenance. Some things are kept because someone was careful before you, Elias told her one August afternoon, while Stella held a shutter spring no longer than an eyelash. You will live better if you remember. She did not understand the size of the sentence then. She understood only that he meant tools. Perhaps cameras. Perhaps the old mahogany cases he wiped down with lemon oil on the last Saturday of every month. Years later, with cold concrete under her hip and traffic passing over her like weather, she would hear his voice in that sentence and understand he had meant almost everything. Elias died on February 4, 2019, after a winter cough settled deep and stayed. He was 78. The hospital room in Tucson had a view of a parking structure and one palm tree planted in a square of gravel, its fronds beating against the wind like a hand trying to refuse something. Stella sat beside him for 2 evenings. Marianne came once, wearing perfume too bright for the room, and spent most of the visit speaking with a nurse about paperwork. Elias was smaller by then, folded under blankets, his hands reduced but still precise when they moved. He tapped twice on Stella's knuckles to wake her when she dozed. "Bench key," he whispered. She leaned close. "Top drawer. Wrapped in blue." Those were the last craft words he gave her. After the funeral, which was modest and windblown and attended by 6 people, Stella asked about the wooden case. Marianne said there would be time for that. Then the duplex was cleaned out in 3 days by men with a rented trailer and no particular respect for drawers. The brass-cornered case vanished. So did the notebooks, the lens blocks, the cigar tins of screws, the shutter tester, the small grinding stones, and the blue cloth Elias had folded over important things. Stella found one object beneath the passenger seat of Marianne's car 2 weeks later. A compact screwdriver set, 7 tools in a cracked brown sleeve, smallest handle worn smooth by Elias's thumb. She took it without asking. Theft was the word her mother would have used. Inheritance was the word Stella kept. By then Marianne had married Warner Klein. Warner did not arrive like a storm. He arrived like weather that had already decided the shape of the season. He was a broad man with carefully trimmed sideburns, a belt buckle too polished, and pale eyes that made slow inventories of rooms. He worked as a night supervisor at a freight warehouse near the interstate, or said he did. His boots were always clean at the wrong times. His shirt smelled faintly of cologne and cigarette smoke hidden under peppermint. He did not raise his voice at first. He corrected. A plate left too near the sink. A light on in the hallway. A towel folded in thirds instead of halves. A girl of 16 sitting at the table too late, repairing a thrift store camera with borrowed tweezers. He had a way of making ordinary actions seem like evidence. If Stella opened the refrigerator, he noticed. If she stayed in her room, he noticed. If she spoke, he examined the words. If she remained silent, he supplied a meaning for that silence and set it down as fact. Marianne became quieter during those years, not in the settled way of a person at peace, but in the careful way of someone walking through a house of thin glass. She laughed before Warner finished jokes. She apologized for weather. She stood between rooms and listened before entering, as if the walls had become supervisors. Stella finished high school without photographs. She worked afternoons at a drugstore photo counter that mostly printed phone pictures and passport images. But in a bottom cabinet under obsolete paper rolls she found a forgotten loop, 2 film tanks, and a bottle opener bent into usefulness. Customers brought disposable cameras after weddings, road trips, birthday parties. Once, an old man brought in 3 rolls of 35mm Tri-X wrapped in foil, and Stella held them as if they were living things. At night she repaired what she could. Yard sale cameras, broken lenses from online listings, a Pentax with sand under the advance lever, a Rolleicord whose focusing knob dragged. She did not own proper equipment, but she had Elias's screwdrivers, sewing needles, toothpicks, lighter fluid, cotton swabs, patience, and a kind of stubborn exactness that could pass for calm if no one looked too long. Warner looked too long. The final winter in Marianne's house had no single beginning. It gathered in small cold deposits. Stella's bedroom door no longer closed because Warner had removed the latch after saying privacy made people dishonest. Her mail arrived opened. Her shifts at the drugstore were questioned. When she bought a torn canvas tool roll from a thrift shop for $2, he held it up between two fingers and asked who she thought she was pretending to be. Marianne stood at the sink, rinsing a clean plate. That was her posture most often by then. Back turned, hands occupied, water running. On January 17, 2022, Stella came home after closing the photo counter and found her jacket on the porch rail. Not hung there, thrown. The left pocket had split wider, and the lining showed where she had stitched it by hand. Inside the house, the television murmured low. The porch light buzzed over a scatter of dead moths. Her breath showed once and then vanished. Beside the jacket sat a brown grocery sack. In it were 2 shirts, 1 pair of socks, a toothbrush, Elias's screwdriver sleeve, and the little black notebook where she wrote shutter speeds by sound. The notebook had been bent under something heavy. One corner was damp. Warner opened the door before she touched the knob. Marianne stood behind him in the hallway. One hand on the frame, her wedding ring bright against paint worn dull by other hands. Warner held up the notebook. "No more poison in my house after tonight." 8 words, spoken evenly. Stella looked at her mother, not for rescue, not exactly, but for the smallest sign that the woman who had once sung over pancakes could still remember the child at her kitchen table. Marianne's lips parted. Her eyes lowered to the grocery sack. Then she turned her face toward the living room, where blue light from the television moved across the wall. The door closed with care. Stella stood on the porch long enough for the cold to pass through the soles of her shoes. She put on the torn jacket. She folded the notebook flat as best she could and slid it under her shirt where body heat might dry the paper. Then she picked up the grocery sack and walked away without knocking again. A person might imagine that leaving begins with movement, but sometimes it begins with not turning back. The first night she slept behind a closed tire shop off East Benson Highway, under an overhang that smelled of rubber, oil, and rainwater trapped in old buckets. She put the grocery sack inside her jacket and folded herself around it. At dawn, a man unlocking the service bay saw her, paused, and told her the Circle K had hot water if she bought tea. He did not say she could not stay. He did not say she could. His kindness was the narrow kind people offer when they are afraid of making a promise. She had $64 then. Pay from 2 shifts, minus bus fare, minus a pack of crackers, minus the $3 she had given a laundromat machine that swallowed quarters without starting. For 6 weeks she lived in a map made of public rooms and hidden corners. In Tucson she slept twice in the all-night waiting area at the bus station, seated upright with her chin tucked into the torn collar of her jacket, the grocery sack tied to her wrist with a strip from one ruined shirt. A security guard woke her the 3rd morning by tapping the toe of her shoe with his flashlight. He was not cruel. He was tired. That can look similar when a person has nowhere to go. She rode east to Benson because the ticket was cheap and because the name looked gentle printed on the schedule. In Benson she washed in a gas station sink before dawn, using paper towels rough enough to redden her skin. She found a church that served soup on Thursdays and a thrift store where an older volunteer slipped a wool hat into her bag without charging. From Benson she took a ride with a woman delivering eggs to Tombstone, sitting between cartons in the back of a van that smelled of straw and yolk and old vinyl. Tombstone was all false fronts and tourist doors, but behind the brighter streets were alleys where wind collected dust in patient drifts. She slept one night under a wooden staircase behind a closed saloon, woke with grit in her teeth, and used Elias's smallest screwdriver to fix the loose temple screw on her glasses by the light of a vending machine. In Sierra Vista she spent 2 nights in a shelter, lying on a narrow cot beneath a blanket washed so many times it had become nearly weightless. The woman in the cot beside her had purple shoes and a cough she tried to hide in her pillow. Stella gave her half a sleeve of saltines. The woman gave Stella the address of a day labor office where, for 9 hours, she sorted returned uniforms into bins marked by size. She earned $43 and spent 9 of it on socks, antiseptic, and a notebook because the old one still smelled faintly of porch rain. She did not write about Marianne. She wrote shutter sounds from memory. 1/30th, lazy. 1/60th, clean. 1/125th, clipped. She wrote the names of cameras she had touched so she would not become only a person moving from bench to bench. Argus C3, Kodak Retina, Speed Graphic, Yashica Mat. Names could be a railing in weather. By the time she reached Douglas, she had $21 and a bruise on one hip from sleeping against the metal arm of a depot bench. Douglas sat against the border with its wide sky and tired storefronts, beautiful in a way that asked nothing of anyone. She spent afternoons in the public library because libraries let a person be still without purchasing anything. She learned which chairs were watched and which were not. She learned to hold a book open even when the words blurred from hunger. It was there, on a Tuesday with wind pressing dust against the windows, that Stella found the classified ad. Not online, not shining from a screen. It sat in the back pages of a county bulletin left on the periodicals table between a free Spanish-language newspaper and a gardening newsletter 3 months out of date. The paper was folded wrong, as if someone had begun to read it and then been called away by ordinary life. Scanty disposal action, derelict commercial parcels. The listing was narrow and badly aligned. Most entries were tax lots, storage sheds, a roofless garage. 2 parcels described only by numbers. Then came one line that held her. Former camera repair shop, Tombstone Canyon vicinity, Bisbee, Cochise County, structure condemned. Minimum bid $7. Buyer assumes liability. Clearance, and all contents. Deed transfer upon payment. No warranty expressed or implied. Below it, in smaller type, was an address she read 3 times. Stella did not feel hope in the way people describe it later. Clean and sudden, like a lamp brought into a dark room. What came first was recognition. Camera repair shop. Contents. Bisbee. These were words from Elias's old stories. From the years before Tucson. From Saturday afternoons when his hands moved over polished wood and dull brass while he spoke of a cliff town built into copper-colored hills. She copied the address onto the back page of her notebook. Then she sat until the library lights hummed louder than the room. $7 was not an opportunity in any sensible account of the world. It was 3 meals if bought carefully. It was 1 laundromat morning, soap included. It was a bus ticket part of the way and walking after that. It was the exact amount that, once spent, would leave her with $14 and some coins. It was foolish. It was reckless. It was a door with rot around the frame. But the listing said contents. Not salvage. Not debris. Contents. A camera repair shop closed since 1998 might hold nothing but mildew and broken glass. It might hold ruined paper, dead mice, rusted cabinets, and a roof waiting for collapse. It might be a legal trap, a tax burden, a structure so far gone that even the county wanted a stranger to take responsibility for its failure. Stella understood all of that. She had learned, in the careful school of other people's houses, not to confuse need with promise. Still, she thought of the brass-cornered case that had vanished after Elias died. She thought of the blue wrapping he had named in his last breath of trade. She thought of the way Warner had held her notebook like contamination. She thought of Mary Ann turning away before the door closed. A public clock above the librarian's desk clicked from 3:11 to 3:12. Stella went to the copy machine, fed in one of her coins, and made a pale copy of the listing. The machine smelled hot and dusty. The paper came out curled. She folded it into fourths and slid it beside the screwdriver sleeve inside her torn jacket. The bus to Bisbee did not leave from where she was. She would have to get herself north and west by pieces, asking no favors large enough to be remembered. She checked a map at the reference table and traced the road with one finger, Douglas to Bisbee, through land that rose and opened, through scrub, past washes and fences in the long backs of hills. 23 miles by highway. Less if someone knew the old roads. More if a person had to avoid being noticed. At the librarian's desk, an older woman with silver hair and a turquoise ring watched Stella fold the map. "You need directions copied." "Honey?" Stella looked up. The word honey landed strangely. Not soft enough to trust. Not sharp enough to refuse. "Yes." "Mom," she said. "If it isn't too much." The woman copied 2 pages and took only a dime, though the sign said 15 cents each. She pressed the papers flat with her palm before handing them over. Her nails were clean and unpainted. Small scar crossed the back of one hand. "Roads climb some that way," she said. "Nights still get cold." "Yes." "Mom." The librarian studied her for a careful second, then looked away first, which was its own kind of mercy. Outside, late light had turned the parked cars bronze. Wind moved a plastic bag along the curb, lifting and dropping it as if it were trying to learn flight. Stella stood beside the library steps and counted what remained. $14. 3 quarters. 2 dimes. A screwdriver set wrapped in cracked brown leather. A torn jacket with the left pocket stitched badly. A grocery sack too soft now at the handles. A copy of a county notice that no reasonable person would have called a future. She bought a hard roll, peanut butter crackers, and the cheapest bottle of water she could find. Then she walked to the edge of town and waited near a gas station until a produce truck driver, seeing the folded map in her hand, said he could take her as far as the turnoff if she did not mind riding beside crates of lettuce. She did not mind. By evening the truck was climbing out of Douglas, and the light had thinned to the color of pewter over the Mule Mountains. Stella sat with the grocery sack between her shoes and Elias's screwdrivers inside her jacket, feeling each bend in the road through the metal floor. The driver spoke only once, to say there had once been money in Bisbee. Real money. Copper money. And then silence returned to the cab. Ahead, somewhere beyond the darkening hills, a building nobody wanted stood with rain in its back corner, dust across its windows, and a wooden camera waiting in the room behind the counter. The produce truck left her at a dark junction where the highway rose in 2 directions and the wind came down between the hills with the smell of stone. The driver did not ask where she would sleep. He reached behind his seat, took an orange from a paper lunch sack, and placed it on the crate beside her grocery bag. His hand was wide, cracked across the knuckles, and already turning back toward the steering wheel before she could say anything large enough to embarrass them both. "Road climbs," he said. "Yes, sir." He nodded once, as if that settled all that could be settled, and the truck moved off with a shudder of gears, its taillights reddening the dust and then narrowing into the bend. Stella stood there until the sound of the engine became part of the larger silence. The sky had gone that hard Arizona blue that lingers after sunset. Neither day nor night, only a kind of held breath above the ridges. She put the orange into the grocery sack, tightened the torn jacket around herself, and began walking toward the place named on the copied directions. The road did climb. It lifted through scrub and pale grass, past fences sagging between leaning posts, past culverts where the dry washes had cut their patient paths through stone. Here and there, ocotillo stems stood black against the afterlight, their tips faintly red where spring had begun to speak. Stella walked on the shoulder when there was one and on the gravel when there was not, listening for cars before she saw them. Each time headlights came, she stepped farther from the road and turned her face away so no one would have to decide what to do about a young woman alone after dark. By 9 o'clock the cold had settled. A bank clock in Douglas had shown 42 degrees when she left the library, but in the open hills the temperature seemed to drop with every mile. Her hands stiffened around the grocery sack handles. The paper softened where her fingers had sweated earlier and dried now in the wind. She stopped beside a cattle guard and took out the orange. The rind came away in stubborn pieces. She ate slowly, standing under a sky crowded with stars, and tucked the peel into the empty water bottle because Elias had once told her that leaving a place dirty was a way of saying you had not expected to be welcome. Near midnight she found a hay barn set back from the road, roof patched with corrugated tin, one side open to the slope. A gate hung from one hinge and moved a little whenever the wind shifted. Stella waited at the fence, listening for a dog, a man's voice, the low thunder of cattle. Nothing answered except the dry scrape of grass. She slipped through. Inside, the barn held the clean, dusty warmth of stored hay and old animals. Bales were stacked against the north wall, and there was a strip of bare earth where tractor tires had pressed the floor hard. She did not climb high into the hay because that felt like trespass with confidence. She curled behind the lowest stack, laid the grocery sack under her head, and pulled the torn jacket over her knees as far as it would go. At 2 in the morning, she woke shivering. The little thermometer nailed to a post near the open side read 31 degrees, its glass tube glinting when moonlight reached it. She watched her breath rise and vanish. Her shoes had gathered damp through the soles. Somewhere far off, a coyote gave one thin call and then another. Stella pressed Elias's screwdriver sleeve flat against her ribs, not because the tools could warm her, but because they were the one thing she owned that had come to her through a hand that had loved precision more than possession. Before dawn, she left the barn as she had found it, except for a few strands of hay clinging to the sleeve of her jacket. She brushed them away at the fence. The eastern sky had begun to pale behind the ridges, and the cold was changing, becoming less sharp without becoming gentle. A woman in a white Subaru slowed beside her a little after 7. "You headed into Bisbee?" "Yes." "Mom." "Get in if you can sit with paint can." The back seat held 3 covered cans, a folded easel, and a rolled canvas tied with string. The woman had gray hair cut square at her jaw and turquoise earrings that trembled when she spoke. She drove with one hand at the bottom of the wheel and talked in pieces about murals, council fees, tourists who wanted the town to look ruined but not inconvenient, and cats that belonged to no one and everyone. Stella answered when answer was required. The road narrowed as they came near town, bending along the cuts of the hills. Houses appeared first as angles of roof and porch, then as whole structures clinging to slope and stair. Bisbee did not arrive like a flat town with its streets laid obediently before a person. It emerged in ledges. It held itself against the mountains with stone walls, switchbacks, and stairways that seemed to have been built by people who believed the body should remember every errand. The woman led her out near Main Street and pointed with 2 fingers. "County office is that way. Do not trust the first staircase. It lies." Stella almost smiled, but the muscles had been too little used. "Drink water," the woman said, already reaching toward the gear shift. People forget because the air feels kind. The town was waking in narrow sounds. A broom moved across a shop threshold. A delivery cart rattled over uneven pavement. Somewhere above the street, a dog barked once from a porch hidden by bougainvillea and rusted rail. Morning light touched the upper windows first, leaving the sidewalks in blue shade. Stella walked slowly, not from leisure, but from calculation. Her feet hurt along the outer edges where the shoes had rubbed during the night walk. One heel had blistered, broken, and dried to the sock. She did not stop. Stopping made pain louder. She passed the Copper Queen Hotel with its broad old face and hanging balconies, the kind of building that seemed to remember luggage trunks and long skirts without needing to boast of them. A bakery opened its door and let out the smell of yeast and sugar, warm enough to make her mouth fill. Across from it, a narrow art gallery displayed desert landscapes in the front window, all violet shadow and copper ridge. Farther down stood a used bookstore with sun-faded paperbacks leaning in crates outside, a coffee shop with mismatched chairs, a hardware store with a bell over the door, and a barber pole that had stopped turning but not quite given up being read. A pawn and watch repair shop sat under a striped awning, its glass case full of pocket knives, tarnished rings, and old binoculars. Stella paused there longer than she meant to. The small handwritten cards beneath the objects were careful, each item given a number, a date, a claim of working or not working. In the back of the case, half hidden behind a row of belt buckles, was a folding camera with cracked bellows. She did not go inside. The county office occupied a stone-fronted municipal building set a little above the street, reached by steps worn shallow in the middle. The entrance doors were heavy and painted the color of faded cream. On one side of the door, a brass plate held names of departments, some current, some replaced by printed labels taped over the old engraving. Assessor, Recorder, Treasurer, Development Services, Clerk of the Board. Inside, the air was warmer than outside and smelled faintly of floor wax, toner, and paper that had been handled by many careful hands. The lobby had a bench with green vinyl cushions split along the seams. A bulletin board displayed notices about road work, rabies clinics, water restrictions, and a public hearing printed in type too small for tired eyes. Stella stood still long enough to locate the correct window. A sign taped above it read property disposal and tax-deeded parcels. Beneath the sign sat a woman with short white hair and a cardigan the color of oatmeal, though not soft in any ornamental way. She wore square glasses on a chain, and her nameplate, polished at the edges from years of being moved and straightened, read MRS. Evelyn Harrow, Deputy Clerk. Mrs. Harrow was stamping something when Stella approached. The stamp came down with a brass weight, lifted, came down again. The sound had authority but not anger. Stella waited. The clerk finished the page, slid it into a folder, and looked up over her glasses. Her eyes were light brown, steady, and less curious than exact. "Can I help you?" "I came about a disposal parcel." "Mom." "Which part?" Stella unfolded the copied notice from her jacket and placed it on the counter. The paper had gone soft along the folds. "Mrs." Harrow drew it closer with 2 fingers and read the line without moving her lips. Then she looked at Stella's face. The grocery sack, the cracked sleeve cuff, the shoes gray with road dust. Her expression did not change. but something in her posture settled. "You are the—" "Yes." "Mom, do you have identification?" Stella took out the state ID she had guarded through every sleeping place and laid it on the counter beside the notice. Mrs. Harrow compared the card to Stella, then to a sheet in a manila folder pulled from a stack behind her. The folder was marked with a lot number and a red diagonal line. "Former camera repair shop," she said. "Yes." "Mom, you understand this is not a residence cleared for occupancy?" "Yes." "Mom, you understand the roof is compromised?" "Yes." "Mom, you understand the city can require correction, repair, or clearance at your expense?" "Yes." "Mom, you understand utilities have been disconnected for many years?" "Yes." "Mom, you understand there is no warranty on the structure, contents, title history beyond the county's authority, or condition of access?" "Yes." "Mom." Mrs. Harrow laid the folder flat and removed a paper-clipped packet. She had large knuckles, and one finger bent slightly toward the next, perhaps from arthritis, perhaps from years of holding pens too firmly. She turned the first page toward Stella and tapped a paragraph with the back of the pen. "Read this section before you sign." Stella read. Some of the language was legal and cold, full of liability and assumption and indemnification, but the meaning was clear enough. The county wanted out from under the building. The buyer took everything: risk, rot, debt, contents, burden, permission. It was a transaction in which no one pretended generosity. Her eyes reached the line for signature. Mrs. Harrow did not hand her the pen yet. "You are aware demolition was already scheduled?" "Yes." "Mom, once transferred, postponement becomes your responsibility?" "Yes." "Mom, you will need to speak with development services if you intend to stabilize." "Yes." "Mom." The clerk held her a moment longer. "That answer covers a wide field." Stella met her eyes. "It is the answer I have." For the first time, the older woman's mouth changed almost enough to be called a smile. Not fond, not amused, only acknowledging something. She handed over the pen. The pen was heavier than Stella expected, with a chain attached to the counter. She signed where indicated. Her hand did not tremble until after the last letter, and then only slightly, as if the body had waited for the work to be done before admitting what it knew. Mrs. Harrow took the packet, checked each page, initialed 2 corners, and reached beneath the counter for a receipt book. When Stella laid her payment down, the bills looked almost foolish on the broad counter. Mrs. Harrow did not treat them that way. She smoothed them, counted once, wrote the amount in a square blank, and tore the receipt along a perforation with exact pressure. Then came the stamp. It was brass-handled, heavy, and older than the plastic trays around it. Mrs. Harrow inked it on a red pad, aligned it over the bottom of the deed transfer, and brought it down. The counter took the force and gave it back through Stella's forearms. Paid and transferred. The letters appeared dark, official, and strangely final. Mrs. Harrow turned away to make 2 copies. The machine behind her warmed with a low hum. Stella stood with her hands against the counter edge, aware of the room's ordinary noises: a phone ringing twice, a man coughing near another window, paper sliding into paper, the faint buzz of fluorescent lights. Ordinary life continued even while an impossible thing attached itself to her name. When the clerk returned, She placed one copy in a brown envelope, then wrote on the front in blue ink. "Take this to Development Services before the end of the week," she said. "Ask for Mr. Altman. Do not let him give you the large packet first. Ask for the emergency stabilization sheet." "Yes. Mom. You will need to post the transfer notice in the front window." "Yes. Mom. Do you know where Tombstone Canyon Road is?" "I have directions." "Mrs." Harrow took the copied map and examined it. "This will get you there in a manner of speaking." She pulled a blank page from a scratch pad and drew quickly, using straight lines where the town used bends. "Out of this building, right on Main, past the hotel, then up Tombstone Canyon. When you see the old stairs with the blue rail, ignore them unless you enjoy regretting things. Keep to the road until the retaining wall turns redstone. The shop is below a narrow set of walnut trees. There is a sign, if the wind has not finished eating it." Stella folded the page with both hands. "Thank you." Mrs. Harrow held the envelope back for one more second. "Voss," she said. Stella's fingers tightened before she could stop them. The clerk did not miss it. That is not a common name in these particular papers. "No. Mom. I knew a man named Elias Voss, miss." Harrow said. "Not well. My husband had a Rolleiflex he would not let anybody else touch. This was years ago." "Your people?" "My grandfather." A small silence came across the counter. "Mrs." Harrow set the envelope down between them. He had a careful hand. Stella nodded. A word would have broken something, and the clerk seemed to know it. "My husband," said Mr. Voss, "could make a shutter sound honest again," the older woman continued. "He had his first shop not far from that address, before things changed. Not that same building, unless memory has rearranged itself, but near enough to smell the same rain." Stella looked at the envelope, then at Mrs. Harrow's bent finger resting on it. "I did not know that." "No reason you would, unless someone kept the story." The sentence landed without accusation, which made it harder to bear. Mrs. Harrow slid the envelope across. "The posted notice goes in the window. The deed copy stays dry. If anyone bothers you about the building before you have spoken to Development Services, send them to me." "Yes, Mom." "And Miss Voss." Stella looked up. "Do not sleep where masonry can fall." There was no softness in her voice. Only instruction. That Stella could receive. Outside, the sun had climbed over the roofs and warmed the stone steps. Stella sat on the low wall beside the municipal building and opened the brown envelope just enough to look at the deed copy. Her name stood there in black type beneath legal descriptions she barely understood. The paper did not change her hunger, her bruised heel, or the fact that she had nowhere else to go that night. Still, it had weight. It named a place and attached her to it with ink, stamp, and a county seal. She folded the envelope back into her jacket. The walk up Tombstone Canyon Road was steeper than the clerk's quick line suggested. The street ran along the old mining spine of town, past houses perched on ledges and sheds tucked into pockets of rock. Sunlight struck metal roofs and flashed from broken glass in retaining walls. Some yards were tended with fierce devotion, clay pots of geraniums, painted chairs, wind chimes made from spoons, saints in niches, rusted bicycles turned into garden pieces. Others had surrendered to weeds, boards, and weather, not entirely abandoned but no longer arguing with time. A man in a straw hat swept the sidewalk outside a narrow ceramic studio and watched her pass with the frank, noncommittal curiosity of small towns. 2 doors beyond, a woman unloaded crates of second-hand books from a hatchback. An orange cat sat in the window of a frame shop, its tail twitching at no visible threat. A post office truck ground uphill in second gear and left behind the smell of hot brakes. At a bend in the road, a black and white dog lifted its head from the shade beneath a porch. It did not bark at first. It studied her, ears pricked, then gave 3 measured barks as if filing a formal notice. A man's voice from inside called, "Hush!" Raymond and the dog put its head down again without taking its eyes off Stella. She kept walking. The walnut trees appeared after the retaining wall changed from concrete to red stone. There were 3 of them, older than the buildings around them, their limbs bare but already thickening at the buds. Their trunks leaned toward the road as if listening. Beneath them, a narrow path dropped from the shoulder to a lower frontage where 2 structures sat close together, one a collapsed shed with corrugated tin folded inward, the other the building from the county notice. At first Stella did not move. The camera repair shop was smaller than her imagination had made it, and more stubborn. It stood 1 story high, about 24 feet across the front and perhaps 36 deep, with adobe brick side walls patched in places by cinder block and rough stucco. The facade had once been painted cream, but sun and time had reduced it to layers of chalk, tan, and exposed masonry. The roof was a shallow gable under rusted corrugated metal. Its rear corner dipped where water had been entering for years. A narrow brick chimney rose near the back, blackened along one side but still upright. The front door was wood, with a glass upper half. The glass cracked from one corner to the center but held together by old tape gone amber. On either side were display windows clouded nearly white. Behind the dust, shapes waited, shelves. Perhaps boxes, perhaps only the shadows of shelves. Above the door hung a wooden sign on 2 iron brackets. Voss and Lark camera surface. The words were faded almost beyond reading. The paint had lifted from the letters in tiny curled scales, and one edge of the sign had split along the grain. Still, the name was there. Voss. Not imagined. Not memory only. It hung under the walnut branches in the honest light of afternoon. Stella stepped closer. Under the main lettering, smaller words emerged as the angle changed. Shutters, Lentz Bellows Plat Honers. The last word had nearly vanished where rain had found it, but enough remained for the mind to complete. She stood below the sign and read it with the care she would have given an inscription on a grave. The key, when she unfolded it from the envelope, was not a true key but a county-issued lockbox code written on a yellow slip. The actual lockbox hung from the door handle. Cheap and modern, its black metal out of place against the hand-worn wood. Stella turned the small wheels until the shackle released. Inside lay 2 keys on a wire ring, one brass and one steel, both tagged with masking tape. The brass key fit the door. It resisted. She lifted slightly on the knob, the way a person does with aged doors after being taught by weather. The latch gave with a tired click. The door moved inward 6 inches and stopped against something on the floor. Stella put her shoulder to it carefully. Something scraped. Dust rose through the opening, fine as flour and older than her reasons for coming. She covered her mouth with her sleeve and pushed again. The smell came first. Dry wood. Mouse droppings. Mildew. Old paper. Dust made from cotton cloth. Cardboard. Insects. Skin. Plaster. And years. Beneath those was another odor, faint but alive to her, oil. Metal. Leatherette. And the sour-sweet trace of bellows cloth closed too long. She stepped inside. The front room had been a counter once, though the counter was buried under newspapers, invoice pads, dead flies, and a layer of dust thick enough to show the track of her sleeve when she brushed past. Glass display cases ran along the left wall, their contents dim behind grime. Camera bodies lay on faded green felt, box cameras, folding cameras, 2 dented 35mm rangefinders, a flash attachment with a cracked reflector, a row of lens caps like small blind eyes. On the right wall, shelves held cardboard boxes labeled in pencil. She could read some without touching them. Straps. Broken meters. Customer holds. Paid. Never collected. Under the shelves stood a wooden chair with one cane side pushed through, a wastebasket filled with paper that had browned to the color of dried leaves, and an umbrella bleached gray by dust. The floorboards answered under her feet in different voices. Near the door, a hollow complaint. Beside the counter, a lower creak. Toward the back, one sharp snap that made her freeze until the room settled again. Light entered reluctantly through the front windows, diffused by dirt, making every object seem underwater. She found the county notice taped to the inside of the window from some previous inspection, its edges curled. She removed the old tape, posted the new transfer notice beside it, and pressed all 4 corners down with careful fingers. Her name faced the street now. Anyone passing could read it if they cared enough to wipe the glass. Behind the counter, a half door hung open toward the workroom. Stella stood at the threshold. The back room was narrower and darker, with one high window facing the slope and another partly boarded near the roofline. A long workbench ran along the wall beneath the better window. Above it were pegboards where outlines of tools remained darker than the surrounding dust, ghost shapes of what had been removed long ago. But not everything was gone. There were still jars with brass lids, a rack of tiny screwdrivers rusted at the tips, 2 vises mounted to the bench, a magnifying lamp collapsed like a crane, and a wooden cabinet with shallow drawers. On the bench sat a shutter tester, or what was left of one. Its cord had cracked. Its dial glass was broken. A set of calipers lay open beside it, jaws parted as if mid-sentence. In one corner, wrapped in a cloth gray with age, was a lens grinding block. Stella touched only the cloth edge and then let it be. Not yet. At the rear of the room stood the mahogany view camera. It was larger than the folding cameras in front, mounted on a wooden tripod with brass fittings dulled by time. Its bellows were extended halfway, black cloth pleated between front standard and rear frame. The ground glass at the back was veiled with dust but not broken. A lens board sat in place, lens-capped. One tripod leg had been shimmed with folded cardboard so old it had become part of the stance. Stella looked at it a long time. Not because it promised anything. Not yet. Because a camera like that did not belong to haste. It had been made for a person who stood under a dark cloth, looked at the world upside down on ground glass, and waited until light arranged itself honestly enough to be kept. A drip fell somewhere behind the wall. Then another. She found the back corner where the roof had failed. Water stains ran down the plaster in brown fans. The floor beneath was dark and soft-looking, though dry that day. A metal bucket sat under the worst part, half full of dust, leaves, and one dead beetle. Someone had once cared enough to place it there. Then no one had come back to empty it. The back door opened into a narrow strip of yard cut between the building and the slope. It held a rusted barrel, 2 broken crates, weeds, and a fence leaning toward surrender. Beyond the fence, the hill rose in stone, mesquite, and discarded pieces of Bisbee's former industries, a pipe, a rail spike, the square corner of something iron half buried in the ground. There was no water. There was no electricity. There was no heat. but there were walls, a door that locked, and a roof that, despite its wound, had not yet fallen. Stella went back to the front room and began making the first decisions of a person who has crossed from wanting into keeping. She did not clean widely. She did not disturb shelves. She chose one area near the counter where the floor seemed sound, swept it with a straw broom found behind the door, and sent a slow cloud of dust into the air. She worked with the door open until evening light thinned and the cold began returning through the glass. From the grocery sack she took her remaining food, the empty bottle, the folded maps, the county envelope, the screwdriver sleeve, and the notebook. The orange peel bottle went near the door to be carried out later. The copied notice went under the notebook. The deed stayed inside the torn jacket, against her side. When darkness came, it came fully. The front windows held only reflections of the room behind her. Somewhere up on the road, tires moved over gravel. A woman laughed once and then a door closed. The dog named Raymond barked at something with more confidence than concern. Stella lay on the floor behind the counter, using the grocery sack under her head and the torn jacket over her chest. The boards were cold through her clothes. Dust tickled the back of her throat. Her heel pulsed. Every sound in the building found her, the slight tick of cooling metal, the dry shift of paper, the building's ribs answering the night wind, the bucket in the back corner giving one faint ping as the temperature changed. She did not sleep for a long time. Through the grimy window, the walnut branches moved against a strip of moonlit sky. The sign outside creaked once on its iron brackets. She listened to that sound until it became less like warning and more like breath. The house was patient. So was she. By morning, Stella had learned that the front room warmed first and the back room stayed cold as a cellar. She rose before the street above her began carrying voices, not because she had slept well, but because the floor had given her only shallow pieces of sleep, each one interrupted by boards, wind, or the ache in her heel. Dust had settled in her hair and along the sleeves of her jacket. When she sat up, a pale print of her shoulder remained on the floorboards behind the counter, as if the building had taken one careful note of her being there. She opened the front door and let the morning in. Light entered without hurry. It touched the glass cases, the crooked chair, the camera bodies in their patient rows, and the posted notice bearing her name. Outside, the walnut branches trembled in a thin breeze. The road above had not yet become loud, but somewhere nearby a kettle lid rattled. A dog collar chimed, and a woman called to someone named Mateo to bring the blue bucket back when he was done. Stella carried her empty water bottle and grocery sack out to the road and down toward Maine, following the direction of people who had faucets and errands. She found a public restroom behind the visitor center and washed her face in cold water, careful not to meet herself too long in the spotted mirror. Her skin looked gray from dust. Her eyes had the dry, fixed look of someone who had spent too many nights measuring danger by sound. She filled the bottle twice. The first day was not about repair. It was about not making anything worse. She walked the building in daylight with the same method Elias had used on cameras that came into his shop wrapped in towels. Do not begin by taking things apart. Listen first. Look for the order of damage. Find the part that failed, the part that was harmed by the failure, and the part still doing its work quietly. Near the front threshold, the floor dipped but held. Behind the counter, it was cold but firm. In the back corner under the roof leak, the boards had darkened and cupped at their edges. She tested them with the toe of her shoe and felt one give slightly, soft beneath the finish. She marked that place by setting an upturned crate near it and did not step there again. The chimney worried her more than the roof at first, because the cold had settled into her bones and because the black iron stove in the back room looked almost usable. Almost was dangerous. Its stovepipe entered the brick chimney through a rusted thimble, and soot had gathered along the seam like a dark warning. She did not light it. She only opened the stove door and shone a little keychain light inside. Ash lay on the bottom, gray and compact, with a mouse nest built neatly in one corner from paper scraps and cotton thread. She removed the nest with a folded newspaper and carried it outside. In the rear strip of yard, she found what the county papers had called an outhouse, though that was too dignified a word for it. It leaned behind the collapsed shed, door hanging from a leather strap, roof half gone. Inside was a pit sealed by boards and a cracked concrete slab, unusable and unsafe. She backed away slowly, as if the structure might take offense at being judged. For water, there was an exterior spigot near the neighboring retaining wall, dry when she turned it. A pipe rose from the ground near the back fence, capped and wrapped in mineral white crust. She could not tell if it had once been a well line or only part of some later plumbing attempt. She knelt beside it, brushed dirt from the fitting, and saw the metal had split along one side. That would not be solved that morning. The second day, she learned the floor's language. A person living inside a failing building becomes intimate with every answer beneath the foot. Stella walked the room in socks to hear better, placing her heel down first, then the ball of the foot, then shifting weight. She drew a rough map in her notebook. Low Creek near front case. Avoid with weight. Hollow knock by counterstool. Likely loose board, not rot. Sharp snap near back threshold. Nail lifted. No step after dark. She used chalk from a box beneath the counter to mark the safe path, one line from door to counter, one from counter to workbench, one from workbench to back door. The marks looked childish at first, as if a schoolgirl had drawn a route through an attic. By evening they looked like a way to stay alive. The third day, hunger became a regular sound. She bought oats, 2 cans of beans, a bruised apple, and a packet of salt from a discount shelf at a market below Maine. She ate the oats cold, soaked in water in a chipped enamel cup found in the back room cabinet after washing it 3 times. The beans she saved. Heat required fire, and fire required certainty. That morning, she took Mrs. Harrow's advice and went to the hardware store. The bell above the door gave a dry double ring when she entered. The shop was narrow but deep, built into one of the town's slopes so that the front held sunlight and the back held a kind of permanent dusk. Bins of nails stood below hand-lettered labels. Coils of rope hung from pegs. There were shelves of putty knives, pipe fittings, weather stripping, brushes, latches, hinges, mineral spirits, furnace cement, stove polish, and mouse traps. The place smelled of pine boards, metal dust, coffee, and the faint sweet odor of oiled leather. Behind the counter stood a man in his 60s with dark arms, a close white beard, and a tape measure clipped to his belt. One of his ears was notched at the top, as if a piece of him had once been claimed by work. He wore a plaid shirt with the sleeves rolled high and held a pencil tucked behind the good ear. His name, painted on a small sign beside the register, was Martin Rees. He looked at the screwdriver sleeve in Stella's hand before he looked at her face. "You're the Voss girl." Stella had not known the phrase could exist. "I own the camera shop now," she said, because it sounded less fragile. Mr. Ruiz nodded, neither impressed nor doubtful. "Mrs. Harrow called." That explained the lack of surprise. She told me to ask for an emergency stabilization sheet from development service. You... Yes, sir. And they gave me a yellow form and a warning about mason. That sounds like them. He set the pencil down. What is falling first? The back roof corner. Maybe the chimney. The floor under the leak is soft. That is 3 things. Yes, sir. He came around the counter and took a pad from his back pocket. Then we start with fire not killing you, water not entering faster, and feet not going through floor. In that order. I cannot pay for much. I did not ask what you could pay for much. He pointed toward the back aisle. I asked what is falling first. She followed him through the store as he pulled items from shelves and named them the way Elias had named camera parts, not with flourish, but with accuracy. A flue brush, 6-inch round, wire, not nylon, because creosote did not respect gentleness. 2 fiberglass rods, 4 feet each, screw-coupled. A steel bucket. Work gloves from the clearance bin. 1 thumb stained with blue paint. A dust mask. A small stiff brush. Furnace cement in a half-pint tub. Stove gasket rope, though he said hers might not need it yet. A cheap putty knife. A flashlight with a dent in the casing that made it half price. Heavy plastic sheeting. A roll of roofing tape for temporary patching. Not a solution, only a pause. 3 boards of common pine, 8 feet long, to bridge the worst part of the floor until she could do better. He wrote each price beside the item. Used flue brush, 6-inch, $4. 2 rods, mismatched threads but workable, $3 for both. Steel bucket, $2.50. Gloves, $1. Dust mask,
49 cents.
Furnace cement, open but not dry, $1.25. Roofing tape, partial roll, $2. Plastic sheeting remnant, 75 cents. Flashlight, $2. Putty knife, 50 cents. Pine boards, $1 each from the warped stack. The total came to $18.49. Stella looked at the number, then at the coins in her palm. I have $7 and some change today, she said. Mister. Ruiz did not look away, which was kinder than pity and harder than indifference. I figured, I can put some back. No, he tore the top sheet from the pad, folded it, and slid it across the counter. I keep accounts for people who come back. I do not have references. You have a condemned building with your name on it, and Mrs. Harrow said you answer questions straight. He opened an old ledger from beneath the counter. Not a computer screen. A ledger with columns ruled by hand. That will do until it does not. She stood very still. He dipped the pencil point with his tongue, then wrote Voss Camera Shop. Under it, the date. Under that, supplies. I will pay, Stella said. I know. He reached under the counter and brought out a thin booklet with a faded cover. Emergency home repair for owners without contractors. The cover showed a smiling man with a hammer and a roofline no condemned structure had ever resembled. Take this too. It is from 1986. Half of it is wrong for code, but the drawings are plain. How much? Free, if you ignore the electrical chapter. She took the booklet with both hands. At the door, he added, chimney first. Not roof. You can sleep under a leak. You cannot sleep under smoke. Yes, sir. And do not climb anything alone yet. Stella glanced back. Mr. Ruiz had already returned to the counter, but his attention remained on her in the way of craftsmen who pretend they are done speaking, while waiting to see whether a warning has landed. "Yes, sir," she said again. Back at the shop, she laid the supplies on the counter in the order she intended to use them. Elias had taught that disorder was not a sign of genius. It was usually only a person making tomorrow harder. She wrote the list into her notebook with prices beside each item, then drew a box around the total. Debt was a kind of measurement, too. It needed an honest line. Cleaning the chimney took the rest of the day and most of the next. She began by emptying the stove. Ash came out in soft gray plates, then blacker material near the back where damp had entered. She wore the dust mask until breath turned it wet. She scraped the stove floor with the putty knife and found 2 warped screws, a marble, and a charred piece of cloth with a seam still visible. The stovepipe resisted. She loosened the collar with Elias's screwdriver, the largest flathead fitting nearly but not perfectly. She did not force it. She set the tool, adjusted her wrist, and worked the screw back and forth, a 16th turn at a time, until the rust cracked with a tiny sound like ice underfoot. When the pipe came free, soot spilled onto the floor in a heavy black fan. She coughed until her ribs hurt. Then she covered the stove opening with plastic, cut a slit only large enough for the brush rod, and taped the edges as well as she could. The roof was too dangerous, and Mr. Ruiz had said bottom-up would work if she was patient and not proud. She screwed the brush to the first rod, fed it into the chimney, and pushed. At first it moved only inches. Creosote had built-in ridges inside the flue, hardened where old smoke had cooled against brick. She worked the brush upward, twisting as she went, then pulling down, then pushing again. Black flakes rained into the stove and struck the plastic with soft ticking sounds. After 4 feet, she added the second rod. Her shoulders burned. Soot found the seams of her gloves and darkened her wrists. Twice the rod caught so firmly she had to sit back on her heels, breathe through the mask, and begin again. She worked 3 hours, rested, then worked 2 more. By afternoon her hair had gone gray with soot. The front of her shirt was black from chest to waist. Creosote gathered in the bucket as brittle scales, some shiny as coal, some brown and tarry at the edges. She remembered Elias saying that residue told a story. Not only that fire had burned, but how. Too cold. Too damp. Too little draft. Too much neglect. Machines confessed through wear. So did houses. Near evening the brush broke through a blocked place and moved more freely. Stella stopped, listened, and heard a faint fall of material deep inside the chimney. She fed the rods up and down another 12 times. Then she removed the plastic, swept the stove throat, and shone the flashlight upward. The beam did not reach far, but it found brick instead of black glass. Outside, she checked the chimney base where it met the wall. Several bricks had lost their faces. Mortar had powdered at the joints, especially on the weather side. She did not have the skill to rebuild it yet. But the thimble could be sealed. She scraped loose soot and old cement from the pipe entry, wiped it with a dry rag, and pressed furnace cement into the gaps with the putty knife. The material was dark, gritty, and stubborn. She smoothed it with a wet finger despite the cold and left it to cure as the label instructed. The label said 24 hours before firing. She waited 30. Waiting was easier when it had an instruction attached. During that waiting day, she patched the roof from below as a temporary measure, standing on an upturned crate no higher than her knee and stretching plastic beneath the leak so the water would be directed into the bucket instead of the floor. It was an ugly repair, crinkled and shining, but it gave shape to the problem. Water now had somewhere to go. She laid the pine boards across the soft patch and nailed them lightly through safe edges. Not to fix the floor, only to keep a foot from finding ruin in the dark. One nail bent. She pulled it and used another. One board rocked. She shimmed it with a folded piece of cardboard from an old film paper box. The first fire came on the 5th evening. Stella had gathered kindling from fallen walnut twigs and broken crate slats. Each piece checked for rot and damp. She bought one small bundle of split wood on credit from Mr. Ruiz, who wrote it under her account without comment. Before lighting anything, she opened the stove damper, checked the pipe seam, held a strip of tissue near the open stove door, and watched the draft pull it inward. Only then did she strike a match. The kindling took reluctantly, then with a narrow orange line. Smoke moved upward instead of outward. She kept the stove door cracked until the flames steadied, added one small split, then waited again. The pipe clicked as it warmed. The chimney drew. No smoke curled back into the room. Stella sat on the floor with her back against the counter and watched the first honest heat enter the building. After an hour, she set the enamel cup near the stove with water and oats, stirring with a screwdriver handle because she had not yet found a spoon she trusted. The oats thickened slowly. She added salt and half the bruised apple cut with a pocket knife borrowed from Mr. Ruiz's clearance drawer and charged at 30 cents. The meal was plain. It tasted of metal cup, smoke, and apple skin. She ate every spoonless bite. Heat changed the shop without making it safe. It loosened smells from wood and paper. It made the glass cases sweat faintly along their inner edges. It turned the back room from hostile to watchful. For the first time since the tire shop overhang, Stella slept more than 2 hours at once. The next morning, she began inventory. Not cleaning. Not sorting by desire. Inventory. She opened the front glass cases one at a time, after checking each hinge and sliding her hand beneath the glass in case it had separated from the frame. In the first case were consumer cameras left for repair and never retrieved. Kodak Duoflex, shutter sticky. Argus C3, rangefinder misaligned. Polaroid land camera, Bellows cracked. Minolta SRT body, missing rewind knob. 2 brownies with names written on masking tape, MR. Lewis, P.I'd. S. Ortiz, call when done. In the second case were lenses. Some clouded, some fungus-veined, some clean under dust. A woolen sack enlarging lens in a plastic bubble. A Kodak anastigmat with haze between elements. A Schneider lens cap attached to no lens at all. Filters in metal rings. Yellow. Red. Green. Stacked in tins. A loop with one chipped corner that still magnified cleanly. The drawers behind the counter held paper. Invoices. Repair tickets. Carbon copies. Order forms for film stock long discontinued. Envelopes with negatives that made Stella pause but not open them yet. People's faces were a responsibility, even if abandoned by time. She found a ledger from 1984, then one from 1991, then a stack of blank receipts curled from humidity. The handwriting changed across years. Earlier entries were exact and slanted. Later ones were looser, perhaps from another hand, perhaps from the same hand grown tired. She wrote shelf numbers in her notebook. Front case A. Back shelf B. Counter drawers C1 through C5. Workbench drawers D1 through D12. In the back room, she opened the shallow wooden cabinet. Drawer by drawer, the trade revealed itself in fragments. Retaining rings wrapped in tissue. Tiny screws sorted by head type and diameter. brass lens shims. Focus screen clips. A bottle of Canada balsam hardened to amber. A cracked thermometer. Calipers. Black paper. A ground glass loop. A half-used tin of graphite. A strip of velvet for light seals. Cable releases coiled like a sleep snake's. One envelope labeled shutters that hesitate in damp weather. She read that twice. In another drawer lay bellows patches, black cloth, thin leather, a jar of adhesive with the lid sealed permanently shut, and a narrow wooden tool shaped like a paddle. The tool had been worn smooth at the edges from repeated pressure. She held it for only a moment, then placed it back on the cloth. The pegboard outlines above the workbench suggested theft or rescue, depending on the hand that had emptied it. Missing were the best screwdrivers, the spanner wrenches, the shutter speed tester parts, the lens blocks. Remaining were the humble tools people overlook when they steal quickly: clamps with weak springs, a warped ruler, 2 dull awls, a small hammer with the handle taped, and a brass brush worn almost flat. Then she came to the mahogany view camera. For 2 days, she had avoided touching it beyond wiping dust from the tripod feet. It occupied the rear of the room with a gravity that did not come from size alone. The wood was not merely polished but hand-worn, dark along the edges where palms had lifted and adjusted it over decades. Brass knobs held green shadows in their threads. The bellows, though dusty, had not collapsed. The pleats remained crisp, deeper black in the folds. Stella set a clean towel on the bench and laid her few tools upon it. She began at the tripod. Each leg was inspected for splits. One brass thumbscrew was frozen. She touched it with the smallest amount of penetrating oil on a toothpick, then left it. The head tilt moved stiffly but moved. The rail teeth beneath the camera were packed with dust, which she loosened with a dry brush. She did not run the standards back and forth yet. Dirt could grind into wood and metal. Dirt needed to be lifted, not dragged. The lens cap came off with a soft pop. The front glass beneath was dirty but whole. She breathed lightly across it and saw a crescent of clearer surface where moisture passed. No cleaning yet. The wrong cloth could scratch a century in one careless second. At the rear, she lifted the dark cloth remnant from the ground glass. Dust shifted in a gray sheet. The glass was intact, held by clips darkened with age. When she leaned close, the world through the lens appeared upside down and dim, the workbench inverted, the high window turned on its head, the pale rectangle of day floating beneath the floor. She felt a stillness then, not peace, not even comfort, only alignment. The tool was wounded but not dead. On the third afternoon of inventory, the anomaly announced itself by sound. Stella had learned, from Elias and from hunger, that a thing can be measured without instruments if the hand has been trained to pay attention. She tapped the view camera's wooden frame gently with the back of one knuckle. Mahogany answered with a dull, warm note. Brass answered brighter. The rail gave a narrow clack. The rear standard sounded as expected. The bellows did not. When she flicked one pleat near the lower right corner, it gave a muted thud, not the soft cloth response of empty folded material. She tried the opposite side. That side whispered. She returned to the lower right. Thud. Low. Contained. She did not open anything quickly. First, she tested weight. The camera, even with its old lens, should have shifted in a certain way when tilted. But the rear seemed heavier than the front, and not evenly. She loosened the rail lock a quarter turn and slid the rear standard back 1 inch. Something within the bellows gave the faintest internal knock. Stella stopped moving. A knock inside Bellows could mean loose support, trapped plate holder, a detached frame, or rodent damage. It could mean nothing worth imagining. It could mean the folded cloth had stiffened in one section from old repair. She reached for the flashlight and shone it along the bellows seams. No obvious tear. No nesting. No daylight pinholes. She removed the ground glass frame carefully and set it on the towel. Behind it, where the bellows attached to the rear standard, she found 4 small screws blackened with age. They were not factory matched. 2 were brass. 2 blued steel. Someone had opened this part before and closed it with whatever fit. Her pulse became too audible, so she stood and walked to the front room. She drank water. She counted 10 breaths. She returned. The first screw resisted, then came free with a dry click. The second turned too easily. The third had a slot nearly stripped, and she spent 20 minutes pressing the screwdriver into it, with enough downward force to hold but not enough to tear. The fourth dropped from her fingers and vanished into dust. She froze, then found it by touch against the base rail. With the screws removed, the rear bellows frame loosened but did not release. Along the inner edge was a thin cedar disc, stained black, set into what should have been only a support board. It was not a disc exactly, more of an oval plug, its grain turned crosswise to the surrounding wood. At its center was a pinhole no wider than a sewing needle. Stella sat back on her heels. The shop was very still. She took one of Elias's smallest screwdrivers and touched the edge of the cedar plug. It did not move. She tried the pinhole with a straightened paper clip from the counter drawer. The clip entered a 1/4 inch, struck something, and stopped. She pressed lightly. A small spring, hidden or merely compressed, answered beneath the pressure. The cedar plug shifted outward by the width of a fingernail. Not enough. She did not pry from one side. That would scar the wood and perhaps break whatever held behind it. She worked around the edge with a thin feeler made from a strip of brass shim found in drawer D4, easing dust from the seam. Then she pressed the pin again and caught the plug with 2 fingers as it released. It came free with a sigh of old air. Behind it was a hollow. Not large. Not obvious. A cavity built into the rear support, concealed by the bellows frame when assembled. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth darkened almost black, were 3 packets tied with cotton string, 1 narrow tin box, and a folded leather roll no longer than Stella's hand. She did not touch them for a full minute. The room seemed to lean inward, though nothing moved. When she finally reached into the cavity, she removed the leather roll first because it lay nearest and because tools, if tools they were, should come before paper. The leather had dried but not cracked. Its tie broke when she tried to loosen it. Inside were instruments finer than any she had owned, 2 jeweler's screwdrivers with ebony handles, a brass lens spanner with adjustable points, a pair of curved tweezers wrapped in tissue, a shutter spring hook, a small burnisher, and a folded square of chamois soft as breath. They were not rich tools. They were exact tools. She laid each one on the towel. The tin box came next. It was sealed with wax around the lid. The wax had browned and pulled away in one corner, but mostly held. Stella set it aside. If there was a letter, it might be there. Letters required a different kind of steadiness. The 3 packets were heavier than they looked. The first oilcloth bundle held raw material, sheets of black bellows cloth, still usable where the inner folds had been protected, thin goatskin, strips of brass shim, 2 packets of shutter curtain fabric, and a paper envelope containing lens tissue so fine it seemed impossible it had survived. A note on the envelope, written in faded ink, Read, do not waste good tissue on haste. The second packet held film. Not modern rolls, not the cartridges she had handled at the drugstore, but tightly wrapped rolls in flat envelopes marked by size and process. Some were likely ruined. Some might still hold images if kept from heat and damp. The labels were written in the same controlled hand. 4x5 plates. Mule Pass. Storm coming. Portraits. Lark family. Do not print yet. Lowell District. Last week before closure. EV. At bench. Winter light. EV. Stella touched the initials and withdrew her hand. The third packet was money. At first she understood it only as paper, because the bills were wrapped in a linen cloth and tied with string, their edges aligned. Then she saw denominations. 50s, hundreds, 20s, older series, some worn soft, some crisp enough to suggest they had not passed through many hands. Beneath the bills were coin envelopes in 2 small cloth sacks. She did not count immediately. She put the packet down, stood, and walked outside through the back door. The air was late afternoon cold. The hill behind the shop held sunlight along its upper stones, while the yard lay in shadow. She placed both hands on the fence rail, closed her fingers around splintered wood, and listened to a raven move somewhere above her, wing beats slow and deliberate. Then she went back inside and counted, because not counting would have been another kind of fear. She cleared the workbench, washed her hands with water from the bottle, dried them on the cleanest cloth she had, and laid the bills in stacks by denomination. She wrote each stack in the notebook. $100 bills, $50 bills, $20 bills, tens, fives, ones. She checked every band twice, then counted loose bills a third time, because arithmetic under pressure can become wishful. The paper money came to $48,927. The first cloth sack held silver dollars. Morgan and Peace, their dates ranging from 1881 to 1935. She did not know coin values beyond face and metal, so she counted face only. $73. The second sack held half-dollars. Quarters and dimes, mostly silver, some worn nearly smooth. $38.40.
The envelopes held odd pieces, 2 1909 wheat cents.
1 Indian head cent dated 1907. 4 buffalo nickels, a barber quarter dark with age, and a small gold coin in a paper fold marked "Do not spend unless the roof is gone." She set the gold coin aside without counting it into anything. The penciled note on its fold seemed to have authority. At the bottom of the money packet was a military medal in a small cardboard box. The ribbon had faded, but the bronze star-shaped medal remained legible under dust. Not a Bronze Star medal. She knew enough to see that, but an older service medal with a bar marked 1918. The back had initials scratched lightly with a point, AL. Under the medal lay one final envelope containing coins and a scrap of paper. The scrap read total saved, including coin, $50,000.17, if counted by face and not by sentiment. Stella counted again until the numbers agreed. $50,000.17. The amount sat on the page in her handwriting and did not become less strange by being accurate. She did not laugh. She did not cry. She did not say anything to the empty room. She only placed both palms flat on the bench beside the stacks and lowered her head until dust, old wood, and metal filled the space where breath went in. For a while, nothing happened. Then a truck passed on the road above, and the ordinary sound of it allowed the world to begin again. She rewrapped the bills in the linen, then the oilcloth. She put the coins back into their sacks, the metal into its box, the film into its packet, the tools into their leather roll. The tin box remained unopened beside the towel. Its wax seal caught the last light from the high window. She knew, without touching it, that the letter was there. Not because she could prove it. Because the arrangement had the grammar of intention. Tools first. Material. Film. Money. Metal. Then words sealed against weather and impatience. She did not open the tin that night. Instead, she returned everything except the tools and the tin box to the hidden compartment. Then stopped. That felt wrong. The money was safer concealed, but the tools had been brought out to be used. The film needed darkness and steadiness. The metal deserved not to be shut again without understanding. After several minutes, she wrapped each category separately and placed them in the shallow cabinet drawer D12, the one that still locked with a tiny key taped beneath its rail. The lock was weak, symbolic more than secure, but symbols have their uses when a person is alone. She kept the tin box on the workbench. Dusk gathered in the back room. The stove had gone cold because she had forgotten to feed it. Her hands were black along the fingerprints from old money and chimney soot that no washing had fully removed. The numbers in her notebook looked like someone else's arithmetic. Outside, water moved. She had not noticed it before. Not during the first night. Not during the chimney work. Not while inventorying drawers. But after the long strain of counting, her ears found a sound beyond the back fence. A small seasonal runnel descending the slope through stone, fed by recent rain somewhere higher in the Mule Mountains. It made almost no music, only a thin, steady working over rock. Stella took the flashlight and went out. The ground behind the shop was uneven, and she used the fence for balance until she reached the place where water crossed beneath a tangle of dried grass. It was not a creek anyone would name on a map. It was only a narrow silver movement, no wider than her hand, carrying grit, leaf pieces, and one bead of yellow pollen along a path it had made without announcement. She crouched beside it. Above her, the walnut branches were black against a violet sky. The sign at the front of the shop creaked in its iron brackets. Somewhere beyond the road, a radio played too softly for words. The town was near enough to hear and far enough not to enter. In the workroom behind her sat a sealed tin box she had not opened, and in a locked drawer rested money large enough to alter the shape of a life if a life could be altered by money alone. But the building still had a leaking roof. The chimney still needed masonry work. The floor still held one soft corner. Her heel was still raw. Her mother was still silent in a house she would not return to. Elias was still gone. The water kept moving. Stella watched it until the flashlight dimmed in her hand and the cold came up through the soles of her shoes. The house was patient. So was she. Morning entered through the high back window and found the tin box exactly where Stella had left it. The stove had burned down to white ash. The workroom held that particular cold that comes after a fire has done its best and surrendered before dawn, leaving behind only a faint mineral smell and the memory of warmth and iron. Stella rose from the floor behind the counter with one shoulder stiff and one hand marked by the seam of the grocery sack. For a few seconds, she lay still and listened for the building's ordinary assurances. Sign bracket. Road above. A settling board near the back wall. Wind in the bare walnut branches. Then she remembered the sealed tin. She did not go to it at once. She carried ash from the stove into the yard, swept the hearth with the short brush, filled the enamel cup from her bottle, and drank slowly while standing beside the workbench. The tin waited without insistence. It was rectangular, no longer than a paperback, with its original paint nearly gone and its lid sealed in a dark line of aged wax. A strip of cloth had been wrapped around it once. but time had reduced the cloth to threads clinging at the corners. On the lid, in ink faded to brown, someone had written a single word. Later. The handwriting made her sit down. Not because she recognized it exactly. She had never seen enough of Elias's young hand to compare. But the shape of the L, the patient downward pressure, the clean spacing between letters, all of it came from the same family of motion as the labels in the drawers, the ledger entries, and the notes on envelopes. It was handwriting that had believed care could survive the hand. Stella took out Elias's smallest screwdriver, warmed the blade between her fingers, and lifted the wax a little at a time. It flaked, then softened where her thumb pressed. She worked around the lid without prying the metal. When the seal finally released, it did not crack loudly. It gave a small dry surrender. Inside was a letter folded into thirds, wrapped in waxed paper. Beneath it lay a pressed sprig of something gray-green and brittle, perhaps desert sage, perhaps only a plant chosen because it had been near the door on the day someone needed a witness. The paper was thick, yellowed at the edges, and written on both sides in the same exact hand. Stella unfolded it along its old creases. My dear one, whoever you are, if you have found this, then the shop has outlived my hands, and perhaps yours have come to it in need. I am writing from St. Mary's Hospital in Tucson, where Dr. Samuel Ortega told me on the 17th of March that the trouble in my lungs is not a winter cough and will not be bargained with. He was kind enough to say 6 months and honest enough not to promise 7. I have come back to Bisbee to put my affairs in order, though there is little order left in them, except what I can make with paper, oilcloth, and a steady pen. My name is Evelyn Voss Lark, born in 1907 in Lowell, Arizona, daughter of Matthias Voss, born in 1874 in St. Louis, Missouri, and Adelaide Rice Voss, born in 1879 in a German settlement outside Fredericksburg, Texas. Matthias was the son of Johann Voss, who came west after working as an instrument hand in Cincinnati, and of Clara Brenner Voss, whose people cut glass for spectacles and lanterns before they ever heard of Arizona copper. My mother's father, Emil Rice, ground watch crystals and field lenses before his eyes failed, and my mother said he could tell a scratch from a shadow with one glance toward morning light. That makes 4 generations of people who trusted small work, and I have written their names so that they do not disappear into dust as easily as invoices do. Our trade here began with survey lenses, miner's lamps, and spectacles, then changed with the town. Men came down from the pits with grit in their camera shutters, women brought portraits cracked by heat, and families came with Bellows split at the fold after years in trunks. We repaired what we could. We said no when repair would cost more than mercy allowed. We made do with brass shim, shellac, patience, and the kind of listening a machine earns after it has been kept in service longer than fashion approves. The day that closed us was October 29, 1931. I write the date plainly because grief becomes fog when no one nails it to the wall. That morning, a fire took the room behind the first shop on Brewery Gulch. It began in a cabinet where nitrate negatives had been stored too near a stove by a man who knew better, and that man was my brother, Arthur Louis Lark. He had come home from France after the Great War with his lungs never right and his sleep worse. He was not careless in the old days. War made him hurried in the places where a person must be slow. The fire did not take the whole building, but it took the ledgers, the best grinding tools, 3 customer portraits, and the trust of half the town. Arthur had served in 1918 and carried Musargan mud in his boots long after the boots were gone. My husband, Peter Lark, Died of influenza at Camp Funston in 1918 before he could be shipped anywhere, which was still a war loss, though no monument ever learned his name correctly. My son, Daniel, lived only 2 days in that same terrible autumn. After those losses, and after the fire, I kept the counter open for a while because a person can stand by habit when the heart has sat down. Then one day no one came in, and the silence became my last customer. For more than 30 years I kept the work hidden rather than sold. Not because tools are sacred in themselves, but because they are easily ruined by a hand that wants only their price. I put money aside from repairs, from washing linens, from taking portraits in mining camps, from selling my mother's rings one by one, and from never buying what I could mend. Some of it is in this camera because the camera was the one thing no impatient man wanted to carry. If the craft still calls to someone, remember this: for sticky shutters, clean first with restraint. Flood nothing. Use lighter fluid only where residue requires it, and let every part dry fully before judgment. A copper spring may lie to you when cold, so test near 70 degrees if possible, and again at 50 if the customer lives where winter enters the house. For bellows, use wheat paste thin just enough to brush, not pour, and press cloth to leather under clean weight overnight. 12 hours at least, 24 if the air is damp. For lens edges, blacken only after cleaning, never before. Cerium slurry should be thin as cream, not mud, and the felt must stay wet. If you polish past the scratch, you may polish away the truth of the glass. For ground glass, use 600 grit first, then 1000, always with water, always in circles that do not hurry toward the edge. I have hidden money here, but money is the least faithful object in this box. Spend it only to keep the roof over honest work, to buy heat when winter comes, and to feed the body that must carry the hands. Do not let it make you grand. Grand things are visible from far away and therefore easy to steal, praise, or burn. Careful things are harder to notice. They keep the world from coming apart in small places. Inheritance is not the receiving of what someone saved. It is the decision not to break the chain where it has reached you. You owe me nothing. I do not know your name. You may sell every tool and walk away if survival demands it. I ask only that before you leave, you look carefully at one broken thing and ask whether it is truly finished. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Evelyn Voss Lark, Bisbee, Arizona, April 9, 1964. Stella reached the end and did not move. The stove ticked once, though no fire remained in it. Outside, a car climbed the road in low gear and passed beyond the walnut trees. Dust drifted through the line of light from the high window, each particle bright only while it crossed that narrow place. She read the letter again from the beginning. The second reading was slower. Names that had been information became weight. Matthias, Adelaide, Johann, Clara, Emil, Evelyn, Arthur, Peter, Daniel. Each one stood briefly in the cold workroom as if the air had made room for them. The trade had not begun with Elias and had not ended with Elias. It had moved through hands that crossed rivers, war years, fires, influenza wards, mining streets, hospitals, and the plain discouragement of being forgotten. When Stella finished, she laid the pages flat and smoothed them once with her palm. The paper had softened along the original folds, and she did not force it beyond what it remembered. She folded the letter exactly as it had been folded before, crease into crease, edge into edge. Then she placed it back inside the wax paper but did not close the tin. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was not. She took the letter, the flashlight, and the small pressed sprig from the box, then went through the back door because the room had grown too full of names. The morning had warmed the rear yard only along its upper edges. The fence cast narrow bars of shadow over weeds and broken crate boards. Beyond it, the slope rose in rock and dry grass toward the walnut trees whose roots held the bank. Stella had passed those trees, slept beneath their sound, listened to their branches over the sign, but she had not truly examined them. Evelyn's letter had not mentioned a marker in plain words, yet the names in the letter had turned Stella's attention toward marks, dates, and small things that had escaped haste. She walked to the nearest walnut trunk and circled it slowly. The bark was deeply furrowed, gray in the hollows, brown where weather had split it. A rusted hook had grown nearly into one side. Higher up, beyond easy reach, a horseshoe had been nailed into the trunk decades earlier. The tree had swallowed the ends, leaving the curved iron visible like a dark moon set in wood. A blue thread, nearly gone, clung beneath one nail. Stella stood on a stone and touched the horseshoe with 2 fingers. The iron was cold. She did not know whether Evelyn had placed it there, or Matthias, or someone unnamed who had once come out the back door wiping polish from his hands. But it marked the yard as surely as a family stone in a cemetery. It said someone had stood here and believed this place might need remembering. Below the horseshoe, half hidden by leaf mold, was a flat piece of brick pressed into the ground. Stella cleared it with her fingers. There were initials scratched into the surface before firing or while the clay was still soft. EVL. Not carved for display. Only kept. She sat on her heels until the cold from the ground entered her knees. Then she brushed the leaf mold back around the brick, leaving the initials visible, and returned inside. The old shop did not look different, but she moved through it differently. The front room remained dusty. The cracked window still cracked. The cases still filled with work abandoned by people now old or gone. Yet the objects no longer seemed merely left behind. They seemed paused. There was a difference, and the difference asked something of her. She opened drawer D8, where she had found Bellows cloth, and beneath a packet of brittle receipts discovered a small candle wrapped in wax paper. Its label, written in pencil, read Emergency, 1962. The wick was bent flat. The wax had yellowed. It might refuse to burn after all those years, but she carried it to the counter anyway and set it in a metal film canister packed with sand from the yard. She waited until afternoon light began to withdraw. Then she lit the 60-year-old candle with one of the matches she had bought for the stove. The flame took in 2 attempts. First a blue bead, then a wavering tongue of yellow. It leaned toward the draft beneath the door, straightened, and began to burn with a small, plain steadiness. Stella placed Evelyn's letter beside it. Not close enough for danger, close enough for company. In that modest light, she saw the chain of small kindnesses that had brought her to the workbench. The tire shop man who had mentioned hot water without calling the police. The thrift store volunteer in Benson who had hidden a wool hat inside her bag. The woman with purple shoes in the shelter who had given her the address of the day labor office. The librarian in Douglas who copied the map for a dime and warned her about the cold roads. The produce driver who left her with an orange and no questions. Mrs. Harrow, who had not softened the warnings but had drawn the route by hand. Martin Ruiz, who wrote her name into a ledger as if names did not require proof of worth before being trusted. None of them had rescued her. That mattered. rescue can place one life above another and call the height kindness. These people had done something smaller and, in its way, more durable. They had moved one object within reach. Hot water. A hat. An address. A map. An orange. A direction. Credit. Each thing had been small enough not to frighten the giver and large enough to keep a road open. If you are watching this tonight, perhaps you remember one of those small kindnesses. Not a grand rescue. Not a speech. Not the public kind of generosity people photograph. But a cup of coffee paid for when your hands were shaking, a ride offered in rain, a stranger who looked away at the right moment, a clerk who made the form less cruel. Tell us, if you can, what small kindness stayed with you. Some stories survive because somebody kept the receipt, and some survive because somebody finally said aloud that a small mercy was not small to the person who received it. Stella let the candle burn while the room darkened around it. She did not make plans that evening. Plans would come, and with them the rude arithmetic of shingles, masonry, permits, food, water, and heat. But that night she allowed the letter to sit open in the world after decades of being sealed. She placed the leather tool roll beside it, each instrument aligned on the towel. She set the military medal above the tools, not as decoration, but because it belonged to the same sentence now. When the candle guttered low, she pinched it out with damp fingers and saved the remaining stub. Then she prepared for sleep. The money remained locked away. The film packets rested in the shallow drawer, wrapped against light. The letter she placed inside the tin again, but she left the lid unsealed. On the floor behind the counter, where she had slept since arriving, she laid her torn jacket down first, then the grocery sack folded twice, then the old repair booklet from Mr. Ruiz beneath the edge so that the paper would not curl from damp. Before lying down, she carried the tool roll from the workbench and set it within reach of her right hand. The tin box she placed beside her left. The medal, still in its cardboard case, rested between them. The front window held the reflection of a candleless room. The sign outside moved once in the night air. From the back wall came the faint sound of water descending over stone. Not loud, not constant enough to comfort, but present. Stella lay down on the floor with the heirlooms beside her and listened until the building's cold became familiar. The first snow came on December 6, not as a storm, but as a pale correction laid gently over the town before dawn. By 7 in the morning, 2 inches had gathered along the walnut limbs, the road shoulders, the shed roof that had already collapsed, and the sloped-back corner of the camera shop where the roof had been taking water for years. Bisbee did not hold snow the way northern towns held it. The sun would find the stone by noon, and much of it would vanish into gutters and dirt. But that morning every surface had been made visible by whiteness, especially the wounded ones. Stella stood in the back room with a tin cup of oats cooling in her hand and watched meltwater begin its slow return through the failed corner. The plastic she had hung beneath the leak sagged with cold drops. Water gathered at the lowest fold, fattened, and fell into the bucket. It sounded deliberate. Not dramatic. Not urgent. Only certain. The roof had told the truth all along, and now the weather had signed its name beneath it. She opened Mr. Ruiz's old repair booklet and read the roofing chapter 3 times before the hardware store unlocked. The book's photographs showed a square suburban roof and a man with unscuffed boots kneeling on clean plywood. Nothing in those pages resembled the camera shop's rusted corrugated panels, patched underlayers, cracked fascia, and rear valley where the slope met the masonry wall at a poor angle. Still, The drawings explained order. Remove what is loose. Examine the deck. Sister damaged support. Lay felt in proper courses. Overlap against water's direction. Fasten where structure holds. Flash the joint. Do not trust tar to do the work of wood. She wrote measurements in her notebook. Rear roof plane, roughly 12 feet by 24. Damaged corner, 6 by 8. Sound area uncertain. Rafter spacing, irregular, near 16 inches but not exact. Corrugated metal over old planks. Planks over rafters. Temporary material would not serve through winter. She knew that now. The cash had made repair possible, but possibility was not permission for waste. She took one of the ordinary bills, not one of the old notes, and folded it into her pocket. At the hardware store, she gave Mr. Ruiz an amount toward the ledger first, before asking for more credit. He wrote the payment down without comment, but his pencil paused after the number. Roof now, he said. Yes, sir. How much did it show you? That is the only honest answer a roof gives. He came around the counter and pulled a long sheet of brown paper toward him. Together they worked through material calculations. She would not replace the entire roof that month. She would stabilize and properly rebuild the failed rear section, then plan the rest when weather and money allowed. The repair needed one bundle of 3-tab asphalt shingles for the transition patch over the planked corner where metal had failed, 2 sheets of half-inch exterior plywood to replace rotted decking, a roll of 15-pound felt, galvanized roofing nails, 1 1/4 inch, a handful of 2 1/2-inch framing nails for sistering, a tube of roofing sealant, step flashing pieces where the roof met the chimney shoulder, and 2 8-foot lengths of 2 by 6 to sister the damaged rafters. Mr. Ruiz added a chalk line, then scratched it off the bill. You can borrow. He added a pry bar, then looked at her hands. You can borrow that too. He went into the back and returned with a roofing hatchet whose head had darkened from decades of weather and whose handle had been sanded smooth by a palm long gone. There were shallow cuts along the neck, each one clean and purposeful. My uncle used this on half the roofs in town, he said. He died mean but dry. That counts for something. I cannot take that. You are not taking it. You are using it until you bring it back with no new foolishness on the edge. She accepted it carefully. That afternoon, the skilled elder arrived without introduction. He came up the path below the walnut trees wearing a navy watch cap, a canvas coat, and boots stiff with old tar. He was thin in the permanent way of men who had spent their lives carrying weight before breakfast. His beard was white and sparse. His nose bent slightly to the left, and his right hand missed the tip of the middle finger. He looked at the roof for 5 full minutes before speaking to Stella. Ruse says you listen. I try. That is not the same thing. No, sir. He nodded once, as if the distinction pleased him. Name is Amos Bell. I roofed here when roofs were still ashamed to leak. She offered pay before he could refuse. He refused before she had finished. I do not take money for looking over a young fool with a hatchet. I can pay for your time. You can learn not to fall. That will be payment enough. Amos Bell did not work fast, and he did not explain twice. For 11 days, he came in the mornings after his own coffee and left when the light on the roof turned uncertain. Some days he climbed. Some days he only stood in the yard and corrected her from below. He never carried more than he had to. He did not praise. Praise, from him, seemed to be not having the work thrown back onto the ground. They began with the bad metal. Pry from the fastener, he said. Not from anger. The old panels lifted reluctantly. screaming along rusted nails. Underneath, the planks were worse than Stella had hoped and better than she had feared. 2 had rotted through at the rear corner. One rafter beneath had blackened where water had followed the nail line down into the wood. Voss made her cut back until clean material showed. "Rot lies past where it looks finished," he said. She measured the damaged rafter, cut the 2x6 sister to length with a borrowed handsaw, and held it in place while Amos checked alignment. "Crown up." She turned it. Again, she turned it the other way. Now it knows its job. They fastened the sister rafter alongside the old one with staggered 2.5-inch nails, not all in one line, because wood split when a person pretended force was structure. Amos showed her how to drive the nail in 3 strokes once it was set. First to seat, second to send, third to finish. He could tell by sound when the head was wrong. "That nail's proud." Stella bent close. The head stood a small, bright thickness above the wood. "Pull it." She pulled it. Again. Too deep. She stared at the next one, driven slightly below the surface. "Pull it." By the 4th day, her shoulders ached from lifting plywood and her knees carried bruises in the shape of roof seams. She learned to keep 3 points of contact, to set tools uphill of her body, to speak before moving aboard so Amos did not have to guess. She learned that chalkline was not decoration. The blue snap across felt made a promise. Follow the line and the roof would shed water. Wander from it and winter would teach the lesson again. The first course of felt went down with a careful overlap, lower edge before upper, water always imagined as a patient intruder, looking for a seam. The shingles followed in rows, staggered so no vertical joint invited a straight path downward. Around the chimney shoulder, Amos made her dry fit the step flashing 3 times. "Metal thinks different," he said. "How?" "It remembers being flat." He showed her how to tuck each piece so water met metal, then shingle, then air, never a raw joint. Sealant was used sparingly, not smeared like apology. By the 9th day, she could look at a course and see where it had begun to drift. By the 10th, she caught the drift before Amos spoke. He grunted. That was the only praise. On December 17, the rear patch was complete. Not beautiful in the false way of new work, pretending it had no neighbors. It was square, tight, and honest, set into the weathered roof like a mended sleeve. The old corrugated metal remained across the rest of the roof, patched for the season, but the leaking corner no longer sagged. Inside the back room, the bucket sat dry under the plastic for the first time since Stella had arrived. Amos stood in the yard looking up at the work. "Spring will find what we missed," he said. "Yes, sir." "Then spring can speak when it gets—" He took his hatchet back, ran his thumb carefully along the handle, and looked at her hands. Blisters had opened, dried, and opened again. Tar marked one cuff of her jacket where no washing would remove it. "You did not swing wild," he said. "No, sir." "That is something." Then he walked away beneath the walnut trees, leaving shallow boot marks in the thinning snow. By January, the chimney had become the next honest problem. The roof no longer sent water through the back corner, but the cold deepened, and every fire Stella lit asked whether the bricks above it would continue to consent. From outside, the chimney still stood upright. From nearer, its weakness showed. Several bricks on the weather side had lost their outer faces in thin red flakes, spalling from years of water entering and freezing inside the fired clay. Mortar had turned to powder along 3 joints near the base and 2 near the shoulder. When Stella brushed one seam with a gloved finger, sand fell cleanly away. She did not need Amos to tell her that upright was not the same as sound. Mr. Ruiz sent her to the back of the hardware store, where old materials sat on low shelves beneath dust and handwriting from previous decades. There was a torn bag of hydraulic lime, still dry inside where the outer paper had not split. There was fire clay in a white sack patched with tape. There was clean masonry sand in sealed bags and a small tub of refractory mortar far beyond what she wanted to spend. Do not use modern Portland heavy on old brick unless you want the brick to lose the argument, he said. He wrote ratios on the edge of a cardboard box. 2 parts sharp sand, 1 part hydraulic lime, 1/4 part fire clay near heat. Water by feel, not by drowning. For the inner thimble and stove connection, he allowed a commercial furnace cement, but for the exterior joints and soft brick shoulder, lime-rich mortar would move more kindly with aged material. He made her repeat it back. Why lime? It gives before the brick does. The work took 3 weeks because cold controlled everything. Most mornings were in the 20s, the air sitting between 24 and 28 degrees before the sun reached the yard. Mortar did not like freezing, and Stella did not like waiting, but dislike had no standing before chemistry. She built a small windbreak from scrap plywood and canvas near the chimney base, then warmed the repair area gently with the stove from inside before working outside in short intervals. Mr. Ruiz loaned her a pointing trowel, a jointer, and a stiff mason's brush with bristles worn unevenly. First came removal. She raked out loose mortar by hand, never deeper than sound material required. Using a thin chisel and a bent screwdriver she no longer trusted for finer work. Powder fell onto the cloth she had laid below. Red dust. Gray sand. Tiny root hairs from some long-dead plant that had tried to make a life in the joint. She brushed the cavity clean, misted the old brick lightly so it would not steal water too quickly from the new mortar, and covered the area when clouds came over the sun. Her bare hands went numb every 15 minutes. Gloves were clumsy for pointing, especially in tight joints, and more than once she removed them to press mortar where the trowel could not persuade it. Cold entered through the wet lime mixture and climbed her fingers with deliberate cruelty. She worked until touch became dull, then stopped, went inside, held her hands near the stove without scorching them, and waited for pain to return as feeling. After that, she went back out. The first batch was too wet. It sagged in the joint and stained the brick below. Stella scraped it out, swore once under her breath, and began again. The second batch was too dry, crumbling as she tried to press it in. The third held when she cut it with the trowel and lifted it. Mr. Ruiz had told her to look for peanut butter, but not the kind sold in jars now. The kind stirred from oil and ground nuts, dense but willing. She learned. Load the hawk. Cut a narrow line of mortar. Press from the back of the joint forward. Pack in layers, not one proud smear across the face. Strike the joint after thumbprint hardness, not when wet and shining. Brush the smear before it cured. Cover from frost. Let lime take its slow breath from the air. Inside, she removed the rusted stovepipe again and inspected the thimble. The old metal collar had pitted but not failed. Around it, the brick had widened into crumbly gaps. She cleaned soot and loose mortar, then pressed a fire clay-rich mix around the masonry and finished the immediate pipe seam with furnace cement. The material darkened as it cured, forming a tight collar around the opening. At night, without a fire, the shop grew bitter. She slept in her wool hat and 2 shirts, feet wrapped in the spare cloth she had once used to protect the film packets while moving them to a dryer drawer. Her breath dampened the inside of the jacket collar. Water in the enamel cup formed a thin skin of ice one morning near the front room, a delicate circle that broke without sound when she touched it. But the chimney improved by inches. A joint filled. A brick face stabilized with careful patching. A shoulder flashed from above during the roof work, now sealed more fully below. On the last week of January, with the mortar cured enough and the sky clear, Stella prepared the test fire. She checked the draft with tissue. She warmed the chimney first by burning a twist of newspaper near the flue opening, then fed kindling no thicker than her finger. She watched the pipe seam. She watched the thimble. She went outside and watched the chimney top. Smoke rose clean. Not into the room. Not along the wall. Not from cracks in the shoulder. It went upward in a narrow gray ribbon, thinned in the cold, and disappeared above the walnut limbs. She stood in the yard for several minutes, hands tucked beneath her arms, looking at that plain, correct ascent. Martin Ruiz came by at closing, as he sometimes did under the excuse of delivering a forgotten nail size or retrieving a tool he had not asked for earlier. He looked at the chimney, at the fresh joints, at the smoke leaving properly. Draft. Yes. Sir? Joints held. So far. They held the only test that matters today. He gave her a paper bag from Doris's cafe without explanation. Inside was a biscuit, split and buttered, wrapped in wax paper. Still warm. Stella looked toward Main Street. Mr. Ruiz was already walking back uphill. The floors had been waiting under every other repair, speaking in creaks, dips, and cold drafts. By late January, with the chimney drawing and the roof no longer pouring water into the back corner, Stella began the work at her feet. The front room boards were white pine, though age, dust, and old finish had darkened them almost brown in the traffic paths. They had been laid in uneven widths, some 6 inches, some nearly 9, joined with hand-cut rosehead nails that caught light differently than modern round heads. In places, the nails had loosened and stood proud. In others, someone had driven later wire nails beside them, as if impatience could make a floor forget its first fastening. She did not intend to make it new. New would have been an insult. The softboards beneath the former leak had to be lifted and replaced. She worked with a pry bar and a wood block to protect the neighboring planks, easing each board up slowly so the old nails did not tear more than necessary. The worst plank came apart in 2 damp layers, rot having eaten from below while the top pretended to remain whole. Beneath it, the joist edge had softened but not failed. She dried the cavity with heat and air for 2 days, then sistered a short support block alongside the damaged area using screws mister. Ruiz said could be forgiven because they would not be visible and because people who worship old nails sometimes fall through old floors. For replacement, Amos Bell sent word through Mr. Ruiz that there was white pine in a shed behind his cousin's place, removed from a porch 20 years before and too good for firewood. Stella paid modestly because Amos refused to discuss money and because Mr. Ruiz insisted payment could travel through him without making the old man quarrel. The salvage boards were not perfect. That was why they belonged. She planed one edge by hand, trimmed the ends square, and set them into the gap with rosehead nails from a small, expensive packet she bought only after standing in the aisle for 10 minutes. Nailing old-style heads required care. Strike too hard and the head deformed. Strike poorly and the hammer marked the pine. She set each nail through a pre-drilled hole, used wax on the shank, and drove it until the head sat just above the surface, then tapped it home with a nail set made from a worn punch. After repair came sanding. The random orbit sander rented for $14 a day from a shop near the edge of town, where a man with a gray ponytail made her sign 3 lines and warned her that ruined pads cost extra. She rented it for 2 days and returned it before closing both days because late fees would have made the machine too expensive to touch. She began with 80 grit, not lower, because the floor did not need punishment. The first pass lifted the worst of the dirt and old finish in uneven clouds. She worked with the grain where possible, though the round pad made its own small circles, and kept the machine moving so it would not leave dish marks in the pine. Dust filled the room despite the collection bag. It found her eyebrows, the crease of her neck, the seam of the jacket, the glass cases she had covered with sheets, the camera bodies she had moved to higher shelves. The floor changed slowly. Under the dark traffic paths, a deep honey color appeared, then amber, then, in places where old oil had penetrated, something closer to mahogany. Not the red shine of furniture polish, but a warm, kept darkness that had entered the grain through years of feet, wax, dust, and sun. She vacuumed with a borrowed shop vac until the motor smelled hot, then wiped the boards with slightly damp cloths and waited for them to dry. The second pass was 120 grit. The third was 220, done by hand in the corners where the sander could not reach without chewing the baseboards. Her knees complained. Her wrists stiffened. The broken heel had healed badly and reopened when she knelt too long. She wrapped it at night and ignored it poorly. For finish, Mr. Ruiz recommended tung oil cut for the first coat, then linseed oil only where the older boards seemed thirsty and not sealed by previous treatments. He made her read the rag warning twice. "Oily rags burn houses," he said. "Yes, sir?" Not metaphoric. "Yes, sir." She laid the first coat thin, working it into the wood with a cloth wrapped around a block, then wiped back every place that shone too wet. The pine drank unevenly. The new boards lightened golden, the old boards deepened, and the dark honey near the counter bloomed into a color nearly mahogany where decades of shoes had passed. She waited 48 hours before the second coat, though waiting made the room feel unfinished. The third coat came after another 48. Lighter still, burnished by hand with a clean cloth until the floor reflected nothing exactly but gave back a low, settled glow. One bad morning came between the second and third coat. It was not caused by disaster. That made it harder to respect. The roof held. The chimney drew. The floor had begun to become beautiful in its weathered way. There was food enough for the day and work enough for 10. Still, Stella woke before dawn with a heaviness that did not belong to sleep. Her arms ached. Her hands had small cuts at nearly every knuckle. Her mind moved toward the next task and found only a wall. She sat on the edge of the floor behind the counter while morning spread across the front windows. The sander had been returned. The rags were safe in a lidded metal can outside. Nothing was urgent enough to use as a whip. She put on her torn jacket, took a heel of bread, and walked out of the shop without opening the notebook. Below the town, where drainage gathered after winter weather, there was a marshy, low place people crossed without naming. It held cattails, rusted cans, water reflecting the sky in broken patches, and footprints of dogs, birds, and sometimes children. Stella found a flat stone at the edge and sat there with her hands inside her sleeves. A great blue heron stood in the shallows. Its body was the color of weathered slate, its neck folded into a question too old to need answering. It lifted one leg with such slow exactness that the movement seemed not movement at all but an agreement between bird and water. Stella watched it for nearly an hour. The heron struck once, missed, and returned to stillness without embarrassment. She did not work that day. She ate bread, watched water take light apart, and let the shop stand without her for one morning. The world did not punish the pause. By afternoon, wind had come up, and the heron rose from the marsh with wings wide enough to make silence visible. The next day, Stella returned to the floor and laid the final coat. February came with hard light and cold mornings that gave way to afternoons bright enough to make every cracked pane show itself. There were 8 windows in the camera shop if the back transom was counted, and Stella counted it because air did. 3 had no glass at all, only cardboard, brittle tape, and 1 square of plywood nailed from the inside. 4 were cracked, some in a single clean diagonal, others starred from impact. 1 window, high in the workroom above the bench, still held original wavy glass dated in a corner by a scratch number and a penciled note on the sash, 1898. Do not replace. She obeyed the note before she understood it. The front display windows were too large for her to handle alone, so she began with the smaller sash windows in the back room and side wall. Mr. Ruiz sold her salvage panes from his storage shed, each wrapped in newspaper and sorted by approximate size. New glass would have been clearer. Salvage glass had small waves, bubbles, and a faint green edge when held to the light. It belonged better. He placed a tub of DAP 33 glazing putty on the counter. "Warm it in your hands first," he said. "Cold putty fights like a mule." She bought a glazing point driver, used and reluctant, a narrow putty knife, a packet of points, primer, and cotton sash cord. 1/4 inch, because 2 windows had weight still hiding in their pockets, but no working cords. Removing old putty became a study in persuasion. Heat, but not too much. Scrape, but not toward the glass. Support the pane from the other side. Save any triangle of old glass large enough to cover a future break. Wear gloves, because windows remember every careless hand that has touched them. The cracked panes came free with soft, dangerous sounds. She wrapped them in paper and set them aside in a crate marked broken glass. Not trash. Some things needed correct naming even at the end. The sash cords were harder. She pried off the narrow stops without splitting them, numbered each piece with pencil, and opened the weight pockets. Inside were iron counterweights, dusty but waiting, each hanging uselessly from a frayed end of cord or lying at the bottom where the rope had failed. She tied the new 1/4 inch cotton sash cord to the weight with a figure 8 knot, pulled it snug, then threaded it over the pulley, listening for the wheel's dry complaint. The first knot slipped. She retied it, dressed it properly, and pulled until it held. The sash rose 6 inches and stayed. That small obedience felt almost extravagant. For glazing, she rolled putty into a rope between her palms until it softened, pressed a bedding layer into the rabbet, set the glass gently, and fixed it with points spaced careful and even. Then came the face putty, pressed in with the knife at a clean angle so rain would run away instead of resting against the wood. Her first bevel looked wavy. She scraped it off and did it again. The second was better. By the 4th window, her wrist learned the pressure. The original 1898 glass she did not remove. Its putty had cracked but still held in most places, and Mr. Ruiz said repair in place if the glass was sound and old. She cleaned the loose edges with a pick, brushed the wood, primed bare spots, and packed new putty only where failure had opened gaps. The glass distorted the world behind it, turning the walnut branches into slow greenish curves and the workbench into something seen through water. Stella liked that. Exactness did not always require perfect clarity. Sometimes it meant preserving the old way light entered. The front display windows took 2 afternoons with help from Amos Bell, who arrived carrying suction cups borrowed from a man who installed shower doors. "Do not thank me," he said. I am here to keep you from inventing stupidity. Yes, sir. The largest cracked pane came out in one piece, though it trembled so badly between them that Stella felt the sound in her teeth. The replacement was salvaged from a closed storefront in Lowell. Not flawless, but whole. Together they set it into the frame, pressed points, and glazed slowly along the bottom edge where rain would test first. Amos watched her final pass with the putty knife. Too much. She scraped a little away. Now not enough. She added less than she wanted. He grunted. The last window was the side sash facing the walnut trees. By then, the room had changed in ways Stella noticed only when she stopped. Less wind entered. Dust no longer lifted from every shelf when a truck passed above. The candle flame, when she lit it at dusk, stood straighter. Sounds from the road came softened, held outside by glass and putty and repaired wood. She worked that final afternoon with the window open, the sash resting on the bench, a new cord threaded and tied, the glass bedded carefully in softened DAP 33. The air carried a hint of thaw, not warmth exactly, but the first loosening of winter's fist. As she pressed the last glazing point near the upper corner, a chickadee landed on the walnut branch just outside. It was a small bird, round against the cold, black cap sharp above white cheeks. It gripped the branch with delicate certainty and turned its head toward the room. Stella held still with the putty knife in her hand. The bird looked at the window, at her, at the dark interior where cameras waited under sheets, and then it gave one quick shake of its feathers. No song, only presence. After a few seconds, it lifted away, the branch rising after it. Stella finished the bevel slowly, cleaned the knife on a scrap of cardboard, and set the sash back into its frame. The cord moved over the pulley. The counterweight answered inside the wall. She lowered the window until it met the sill with a sound so clean it seemed almost spoken. By late February, the walls began asking for attention in a quieter voice than the roof or chimney had used. The plaster had held longer than most people would have expected. It was not the thin modern skin Stella had seen in apartments and offices, but horsehair plaster laid over hand-split oak lath, 3 coats in places, with the hair still visible in broken edges like gray and tan threads caught in old clay. Whoever had done it first had known how to press material through the lath so it mushroomed behind the strips and locked itself there. Those keys had held through heat, abandonment, winter damp, and the long insult of being ignored. Near the chimney, however, 3 patches had failed. One was the size of a dinner plate just above the stovepipe. One ran in a crooked oval along the side wall where smoke, heat, and water had argued for years. The last hung loose behind the workbench, a bulged section that sounded hollow when tapped with a knuckle. It had not fallen yet, but it had already left. Stella moved every tool from the bench, covered the floor with flattened cardboard, and studied the damaged places before touching them. The rule remained. Do not tear out what still works because brokenness has frightened you. She marked the loose perimeter with chalk, then used a utility knife and a small pry tool to remove only plaster that had lost its grip. Dust fell in soft beige sheets. Beneath it, the oak lath appeared, rough, darkened, and split by hand rather than saw, each strip irregular enough to feel personal. Mr. Ruiz had saved a paper grocery sack for her in the back of the store. Inside was a smaller bag, yellowed and tied with string. "Horsehair," he said. Stella looked at him. "From my father's shelf. 1950s. Maybe." He patched walls for people who still knew what walls were made of. The hair was clean but brittle in places, dark brown and gray, cut in uneven lengths. It smelled faintly of dust and old barns. Mr. Ruiz also sold her lime, fine sand, and a small amount of gauging plaster, warning her that modern shortcuts could make a hard island in a soft wall. 3 coats, he said. Scratch, brown, finish. Yes, sir. Scratch gets scored. Yes, sir. Brown brings the plain. Yes, sir. Finish is not cake frosting. She wrote that in the notebook because it sounded like something Amos might have said if walls had been his trade. The scratch coat was hardest to trust. She dampened the lath lightly, mixed lime mortar with sand and horsehair until the fibers disappeared through the mass, then pressed it into the gaps with a trowel, forcing material between the lath so it could curl behind and hold. The first patch sagged at one edge. She scraped it back and made the mix firmer. The second held. While it was still green, she scored the surface with crosshatch lines so the next coat would have grip. She let it cure slowly. The brown coat came after the scratch had set enough to receive weight without complaint. 3/8 of an inch. Mr. Ruiz had said, though the old wall did not measure like a new wall, and Stella learned to use the straight edge across the surrounding plaster more than the ruler. The brown coat brought the failed places back toward the same plane as the rest of the room. She floated it with a wood block, misted it when it dried too quickly near the stove, and waited 72 hours because lime did not respect impatience. The finish coat was thin, 1/8 inch, smoother, paler, and less forgiving. Her first pass carried a ridge. She scraped it down. Her second left a hollow near the upper corner. She filled and feathered, holding the trowel nearly flat, wiping its edge after every pull. The repaired areas did not vanish. They were not supposed to vanish. In afternoon light, they showed as calm, pale shapes near the chimney, like bandages left after a wound had become part of the body's record. When the final patch had tightened and begun its slow cure, Stella stood in the middle of the workroom with lime dust on her sleeves and horsehair caught at one cuff. The stove was cold, the windows were closed, and the air smelled mineral, clean, and slightly damp. She touched the wall beside the chimney with the backs of her fingers. These patches will hold another 100 years. She said it because the room could receive a sentence like that. Not as a boast. As a promise made softly to material that had already done more than its share. Doris came before Stella knew her name. The first bag appeared on the doorstep during the second week of roof work, folded tight at the top and weighted with a can of peaches so the wind would not take it. Stella found it at dawn when she opened the front door to sweep dust from the threshold. Inside were 2 biscuits wrapped in wax paper, a boiled egg, and a small jar of soup with masking tape across the lid. The tape said only, "Return jar." She looked up and down the road. No one claimed it. The next morning there was another bag. Cornbread, beans, 1 bruised pear, and the same instruction about the jar. On the third morning, Stella carried the clean glass jar down to the cafe whose back door opened toward a narrow service lane. The sign above the front window read Doris Lunch, painted in green letters that had faded differently on each board. Inside, the cafe was not charming in a way arranged for visitors. It had 4 square tables, a counter with cracked red stools, a coffee urn that breathed steadily, and walls hung with photographs of miners, church suppers, little league teams, and 1 mule wearing a paper crown. The woman behind the counter was broad-shouldered, with iron-gray hair pinned in a net and a face that suggested she had spent her life deciding quickly which complaints were real. Stella placed the washed jar on the counter. "I owe you." Doris looked at the jar. "You returned it." "For the food." I can pay something. No. The word did not rise. It closed the subject like a latch. Stella stood there, feeling the attention of two men drinking coffee at the far table and a woman in a postal uniform unwrapping toast. I do not want to take charity. Doris picked up the jar, inspected it for cleanliness, and set it beneath the counter. Then don't. Pay in candles when the shop reopens. Stella had no answer ready for that. Doris turned to the coffee urn. You make anything that burns? Not yet. Then I have time. The bags continued. Not every day. Never at a rhythm Stella could depend on enough to feel entitled. Some mornings there was food. Some mornings there was nothing, and the nothing kept the gift clean. Doris never asked how much money Stella had or where she had come from. Once, during the floor work, she sent a paper bag containing 2 sandwiches and a note written on order pad paper. Eat before oil fumes make you foolish. Stella kept that note in the drawer beside the repair ledger. Caleb arrived with a splitting maul over one shoulder and a Schwinn bicycle laid against the walnut tree. He was 15 or 16, long-limbed and narrow, with black hair falling into his eyes and elbows showing white through the worn places in his denim jacket. The bicycle was green, with one pedal taped and a milk crate wired over the back wheel. In the crate were kindling pieces cut unevenly from scrap pine. Stella came out of the back door holding a dustpan full of plaster crumbs. The boy lifted his chin toward the stovepipe. You still burning crate wood? When I have it. My mother said that's how people smoke up a chimney wrong. She is probably right. He shifted the maul from one shoulder to the other. I can split better pieces. I cannot hire anybody. He looked offended by the word hire, though he tried to hide it. Didn't ask. I can pay a little. No. My mother said. He looked away toward the road, jaw working as if the rest of the sentence had splinters in it. About your grandfather. Stella waited. Caleb kicked one stone with the toe of his shoe. He fixed her camera once. After my dad died. She said he didn't charge because pictures of the dead already cost enough. The dustpan grew heavy in Stella's hand. What is your mother's name? Marisol. Stella remembered the repair ticket from the front drawer. M. Vega. Minolta SRT. Paid in eggs. She had set it aside because the handwriting beside it had seemed gentler than the rest. Caleb nodded toward the yard. Where do you want the wood? From then on, he came twice a week when school let out early or Saturdays when the weather was clear. He split wood behind the collapsed shed, careful to set the round on flat ground and to clear his feet before each swing. He was not graceful at first. The maul glanced. The wood rolled. He muttered under his breath and corrected himself without waiting for instruction. Stella sharpened the edge once with a file borrowed from Mr. Ruiz, and after that Caleb handled the tool with more respect. He would not come inside for weeks. When he finally did, it was because rain began suddenly and hard, striking the repaired roof with such force that both of them stopped to listen. He stood in the front room near the door, dripping on the newly oiled floor, eyes moving across the display cases. These all... You fixed... Some. He pointed to a brownie. That one looks like a lunchbox. It nearly works like one. He almost smiled. Before leaving, he set one split log beside the stove instead of carrying it to the pile. It was straight-grained and dry, the best piece from the stack. Reverend Boyd did not offer food or labor. He offered a hat tip. Every morning, a little after 8, he walked up Tombstone Canyon Road in a dark wool coat polished shiny at the elbows. He was a tall black man in his 70s, with silver hair cut close and a cane he used only on the steepest part of the hill. Stella later learned his church was small, half congregation and half memory, tucked beside a retaining wall below the main street. On his first pass, he saw her at the front window scraping old tape from the glass and lifted his hat by the brim. She nodded. The next morning, he did the same. By the fifth morning, Stella opened the door before he reached the walnut trees. "Good morning, sir." "Morning, Miss Voss." He knew her name. The town had its own ledger. He did not ask whether she attended church. He did not invite her to anything. He only paused, looked at the sign, then at the doorframe she had been sanding. "Hands learning?" "Yes, sir." Good way to... Then he continued uphill. In February, when Stella was reglazing the side windows and her hands were raw from putty and cold water, Reverend Boyd paused beneath the walnut trees. The morning was clear, and his breath showed faintly when he removed his hat. He turned toward the shop, toward the sign, toward the repaired chimney. "Lord, keep her steady." 4 words. Low enough that they might have been meant for the road. Then he replaced his hat and walked on. Stella stood behind the glass with the putty knife in her hand and did not move until he had passed from sight. The cellar had waited longer than prudence allowed. Stella postponed it through roof work, through chimney work, through floors and windows, telling herself each delay was practical. It was cold below. It might be flooded. The stairs might not hold. Snakes might have found it in warmer months. And worse things than snakes could live in abandoned dark. All of that was true enough. But beneath the practical reasons lay another one. A building that has given one hidden thing may have other silences. On February 11, with the sky clear and the afternoon above freezing, she opened the cellar door. It sat beneath the back workbench, not a trapdoor exactly, but a low plank door in the wall behind a stack of rotted cardboard and 2 empty chemical crates. The iron latch had rusted stiff. She brushed it clean, oiled the pivot, and worked it back and forth until it lifted. Cold air came through the crack with the mineral smell of stone, earth, and long darkness. She set 3 candles on the floor, lit one, and waited to see whether the flame bent strangely. It did not. The 7 granite steps descended steeply, each one cut from a single slab, worn along the center by feet long gone. She tested the first step with her weight, then the second, keeping one hand on the wall. The flashlight beam found fieldstone on both sides, mortar rough between stones, dry in some places, white with mineral bloom in others. The cellar measured roughly 12 by 15 feet. Its floor was fieldstone, irregular but carefully laid, with a shallow channel cut along one edge to carry water toward a drain that had silted in but not vanished. Shelves lined the far wall, most of them empty, a few holding glass bottles, a stoneware crock with no lid, and a wooden crate marked plates, broken, though when Stella opened it, she found only straw and 2 shards of glass. The air was colder than above, but not wet. That was something. At the center of the floor lay a single-dressed granite slab. It did not belong to the rest of the fieldstone. It was rectangular, smooth-faced, and fitted with care, about 3 feet long and 2 feet wide. Near one corner was a carved craft mark, a small circle intersected by a line and a crescent, like a lens, a shutter blade, and a rising moon combined into one private symbol. The mark had been cut shallow, not for display, but for recognition by someone who already knew to look. Stella knelt beside it and set the flashlight low. There was a seam around the slab, but no obvious ring, handle, or notch. Dust had gathered evenly along the edges. Nothing suggested it had moved in many years. She placed one palm on the granite. Cold came up through it immediately. She did not try to lift it. Not that day. Not alone. Not because curiosity lacked strength, but because she had begun to learn the difference between discovery and violation. The slab was not going anywhere. It had waited this long. She stood and examined the rest of the cellar instead. On the stairs going back up, the flashlight caught a shadow under the third step. At first it seemed only a wedge of stone. Then she saw wood grain. A small oak box had been fitted under the overhang, pushed into a recess where a person ascending might miss it unless the light came from below. This box was not sealed with wax. It had a simple brass hasp darkened by age and a lid swollen slightly at one corner. Stella brought it upstairs before opening it. In the workroom light, the oak appeared almost black, its edges polished by handling. Inside lay a brass key and a tintype photograph wrapped in cloth. The key was small but not delicate. Its bow had been shaped like the same craft mark carved into the granite slab: circle, line, crescent. The shaft was plain, the bit cut with 2 square teeth and 1 deep notch. It did not match the shop doors, the cabinet drawer, or the cellar latch. Stella tested none of those. She only laid it on the towel and looked at it until its purpose remained hidden. The tintype was about the size of her palm. A young woman stood in front of the camera shop, or the building that had become it. Though the facade then was cleaner, the sign newer, the walnut trees thinner and lower. She wore a high-collared dress with sleeves gathered at the shoulder and a work apron tied over the front. In one hand she held a lens spanner. In the other, a polished wooden lens board. Her face, though fixed by the old exposure into solemn stillness, carried an unmistakable arrangement. The same brow line Stella saw in dim mirrors, the same mouth held in reserve, the same watchfulness around the eyes. Not identical. No person is, but close enough to make breath careful. Stella turned the plate over. On the back, Clara Mathilde Voss, daughter of founder Matthias Voss, age 25, summer of 1903. Clara. Not the great-great-grandmother from the letter's direct line. Perhaps, or perhaps a sister whose name had traveled into another branch and vanished there. Stella did not know enough yet. But the woman in the tintype stood before this building holding a tool of the trade, and her face had crossed more than a century to arrive like a witness. Stella set the photograph beside Evelyn's letter. The key she placed on the mantel above the stove. For several days after, she noticed it whenever she crossed the room. Brass against dark wood. A question, waiting without impatience. She did not know what it opened. By March, winter loosened its grip one finger at a time. Snow retreated first from the road, then from the redstone retaining wall, then from the shaded places behind the shed where it had hardened into gray crust. The little run of water behind the shop grew louder with snowmelt from higher ground, no longer a thread over stone, but a quick, bright voice moving through weeds and under the fence. The walnut trees changed without ceremony. Buds thickened. Catkins appeared, pale green and soft, hanging from the branches like small tassels stirred by morning air. The shop smelled different. Less of mildew and closed ears. More of oiled wood, lime plaster, stove ash, warm dust, putty, and the faint, clean scent of glass after it has been washed on both sides. Sunlight entered through the repaired windows and crossed the floor in long, imperfect rectangles. Where the 1898 pane distorted the workbench, light bent softly, as if arriving through memory before touching the tools. Stella could have begun the craft then. The temptation stood before her every day. Shutters waited in the cases. Lenses needed cleaning. Bellows lay cracked and possible. The mahogany view camera, after its hidden compartment had been emptied and respectfully closed, stood in the back room with its ground glass cleaned enough to hold an inverted world. Evelyn's instructions rested in the tin box, unfolded more often now. Read until certain lines had begun to live inside Stella's hands. But wanting was not readiness. She decided not to begin real customer work that spring. Not yet. The building had been stabilized, not restored fully. Her own skill, though rooted in Elias's Saturdays, needed practice before it had any right to someone else's irreplaceable object. She took one coin from the cache, not one of the rare ones, not the gold coin marked for the roof, but a worn silver half-dollar whose face had almost lost its sharpness, and sold it through Mr. Ruiz to a collector he trusted. The money bought practice materials, torn bellows from a parts camera, a cracked lens not worth saving except as a lesson, shutter assemblies, already beyond customer use, ground glass blanks, adhesive, black cloth, fine brushes, and a loop strong enough to reveal both dirt and arrogance. Each morning, she repaired the building first. Each afternoon, she practiced on what could forgive failure. She made bad patches and cut them apart. She over-cleaned one shutter blade and watched the finish protest. She mixed wheat paste too thin and saw it wrinkle cloth. She polished a lens edge until she understood Evelyn's warning about removing the truth of the glass. In the notebook, she did not write success unless she could write how it had been achieved. Doris's bags came less often, which meant Stella was standing more firmly. Caleb brought wood even when less was needed, which meant he had begun coming for reasons that included the shop itself. Reverend Boyd still passed in the mornings. Hat lifted, 4 words sometimes spoken, sometimes only carried. In April, Stella washed the front windows from outside and uncovered the sign fully. Voss Lark camera surface emerged not bright, not new, but legible. Beneath it, the smaller words returned to the street: shutters, lenses, bellows, plate holders. People slowed to read them. No one came in yet. That was all right. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, in December 2024, Stella completed the first camera that could honestly leave her bench. It was not a valuable camera in the way auction houses use the word. A folding Kodak, leatherette peeling along one corner, bellows split in 2 pleats, shutter dragging badly at 1/25th, lens hazed with a film that might once have come from a damp closet or from the breath of someone who had opened it too often to look for faces inside. The name on the repair envelope was Mrs. Hell. Mercer, written in a careful hand by a woman who had carried the camera in a pillowcase and held it against her chest while explaining that it had belonged to her father. Stella had not promised repair quickly. She had promised only to look. For 8 evenings, snow gathered and melted in the street outside while she worked under the magnifying lamp. She removed the shutter assembly, mapped each screw, cleaned blades with the restraint Elias had taught and Evelyn had confirmed, replaced one tired spring with a salvage match, patched the bellows with black cloth and thin leather under clean weight for 24 hours, then tested every fold in a dark room with a flashlight inside the body. No pinprick of light came through. The lens cleaned better than expected, though a faint mark remained near the edge. She left it. Some truth belonged to the glass. When the shutter finally clicked at the proper speed, the sound was not loud. It was exact. Stella sat back from the bench and listened to the small silence after it. Outside, cold pressed against the windows. Inside, the stove held a bed of coals. The repaired floor gave back a low amber shine. and the old view camera stood in the corner beneath its dark cloth. She wrote the repair note in her ledger, not with flourish, but with the kind of handwriting a person uses when the record may need to outlive the hand. Cleaned shutter. Patched bellows. Lens cleaned. Edge mark remains. Tested light tight. Ready. The interior by then had become neither museum nor shop, pretending nothing had happened. The front room still held the glass cases, but each had been cleaned and lined with fresh dark cloth. Cameras waiting for repair sat on numbered cards. Finished work rested on the right-hand shelf, wrapped in brown paper and tied with cotton string. The counter had been sanded only where splinters would harm, leaving stains from elbows, tools, invoices, and years. Behind it hung 3 framed things: Evelyn's letter copied on archival paper, the tintype of Clara Matilda Voss, and a blank space where Stella said another photograph might someday belong. The workroom smelled of wax, metal, oil, paper, and the small heat of the lamp. The repaired plaster near the chimney had cured into a pale matte surface. The 1898 window bent winter light over the bench each afternoon. The mantel held the brass key with the craftmark bow, the stub of the old emergency candle, and the military medal in its cardboard case, open but protected. For nearly 2 years, the key had remained there. Stella had tested it in no lock she did not understand. That patience had become one of the shop's disciplines. Some objects tell you where they belong. Others wait until you have learned enough not to force them. The answer came through the walnut tree. A storm in early December brought sleet first, then a night of hard wind. By morning, one large branch had broken from the oldest walnut and fallen across the narrow path, not harming the roof, not touching the sign, but striking the ground with enough force to split a section of bark near the horseshoe. Caleb, older now and taller than Stella by half a head, came with a saw after school. Together they cut the fallen branch into lengths, stacking sound pieces for seasoning and carrying brush to the side yard. When Caleb cleared the last limb, he called her name. Not loudly. That made her come faster. The split in the trunk had opened a narrow vertical seam just below the horseshoe, where the tree had grown around old iron and hidden something beneath folded bark. At first Stella thought the pale line was exposed wood. Then winter light caught metal. A small brass plate had been set into the trunk long ago and swallowed by growth until the storm opened the edge. It bore the same craft mark as the cellar slab and the key bow, circle. Line. Crescent. Caleb stepped back without being asked. Stella brought the key from the mantel. It fit. The plate turned inward with difficulty. Not a door exactly, but a brass-faced plug set into a hollow the tree had grown around for decades. Behind it was a cavity lined in tin, dry enough by some mercy of workmanship and wood. Inside lay an oilcloth packet tied with a faded blue ribbon. The ribbon was the color of the one that had once wrapped Elias's lost bench key, or perhaps Stella only needed it to be. She carried the packet inside before opening it. The oilcloth unfolded stiffly. Within it was a small folded 48-star American flag, its cotton yellowed but intact, and a note written in a hand older and more angular than Evelyn's. To my daughters, and to theirs if the years are merciful. This flag was given to me in 1919 when Peter's trunk came home without Peter. They told me he died before reaching France and spoke as if that made grief smaller. It did not. I have put the flag here because houses burn, men misplace boxes, and sorrow kept in drawers may be thrown away by someone cleaning too quickly. If a daughter finds it, remember that service is not made only of battle. Some serve by leaving, some by returning, some by keeping the lamp lit for hands that will come later. Clara Matilda Voss, November 11, 1933. Stella read the date twice. November 11. Armistice Day. The name made the tintype on the wall seem less like an artifact and more like a person who had finally spoken from the other side of the glass. Clara had hidden the flag 14 years after receiving it, long after the first wave of condolence would have passed, long after others might have asked why she still kept what could not bring anyone back. She had chosen a living tree over a drawer. She had trusted growth to conceal what care could not always protect. Caleb stood near the door, cap in both hands. Should I go? Stella folded the note along its old crease. No. You found it too. He stayed, but he looked at the floor, giving the moment room. On November 11 of that same year, Stella took the military medal and the folded flag to Evergreen Cemetery in Bisbee, where miners, veterans, children, mothers, and strangers lay under stone, wooden crosses, military markers, and small personal offerings left by those who still came. Reverend Boyd walked with her. Doris sent coffee in a thermos. Mr. Ruiz drove because he said ceremonies should not begin with a person worrying about the grade of the road. They did not make a public matter of it. At the veterans section, near a row of markers from the First World War, Reverend Boyd removed his hat. Stella did not know whether Arthur Lewis Lark's body rested there or elsewhere, whether Peter's name had ever been corrected on any official stone, whether Daniel's 2 days had been recorded beyond a hospital page. But she held the 1918 medal in her palm and laid a small wreath of walnut twigs, desert grass, and paper flowers Doris had made from cafe napkins. Reverend Boyd spoke no sermon. He said only, kept, and not forgotten. 4 words would have been enough, but that day he gave 5. The wind moved across the cemetery with the dry sound of grass and flags. Stella stood until her hands grew cold around the metal box. Then she brought it back to the shop, not because the cemetery had no claim, but because Evelyn had kept it in the view camera for a reason. The shop had become a place where such objects could remain held without being hidden from meaning. The money had not become a different life. That was important. 3 coins had been spent in the first year. The worn silver $half for practice materials. 1 common Morgan dollar sold to help pay for the larger front pane when the salvaged glass cracked during installation and had to be replaced. 1 silver dime, nearly smooth, used when Stella needed postage for letters to a camera repair supplier in Ohio who still stocked shutter curtain cloth by the yard. In the second year, she spent 2 more coins, both common and chosen only after Mr. Ruiz had found a reputable collector willing to pay fairly. 1 paid for a proper respirator when she began dealing with old chemical cabinets. The other paid for a used but accurate shutter tester, shipped in a box full of newspaper and smelling faintly of another workshop. The rest remained sealed. Not in the view camera again. That hiding place had done its duty. Stella wrapped the bills and coin sacks in fresh archival paper, placed them in a steel document box, and set that box inside the locked cabinet whose back she had reinforced. On top of the wrapped bundle she placed a note in her own hand. For the next one. Roof first. Food second. Pride never. She did not tell the town the amount. She did not tell Doris, though Doris likely guessed enough to ask nothing. She did not tell Caleb, because young people deserve protection from other people's curiosity. She did not tell Reverend Boyd, who would not have asked. Mrs. Harrow knew only that taxes were paid on time and that the demolition order had been withdrawn after inspections, permits, and more paperwork than any building should have to survive. The shop reopened by index card. No ribbon. No article. No photograph of Stella standing under the sign. Doris pinned the card to the cafe corkboard between a notice for guitar lessons and a lost cat with one green eye. Voss and Lark camera surface. Mechanical shutters. Bellows. Lenses. Limited repairs accepted by appointment. Leave name with... Doris wrote the last line herself and refused to remove it. Within a month, the mailing list held 12 names. By spring, 27. By the second winter, 43 people had asked to be called when Stella was ready to take more repairs or teach a Saturday bench session. Some were collectors from Tucson. Some were former miners' children with cameras found in closets. Some were artists who had moved to Bisbee for light and then discovered that old tools changed the way light was approached. One woman mailed a plate holder from New Mexico with a note saying she had heard there was someone in Bisbee who did not laugh at obsolete things. Stella wrote back by hand. No promise until inspected. Pack with care. Do not tape directly to leather. Work came slowly, which was the only speed at which it could be done, honestly. She accepted one repair, then two, then none for a week while practicing a shutter type she did not yet trust herself with. She refused jobs beyond her ability and gave names of other repairers when she could find them. Some customers respected that more than success. Some did not. The ones who wanted miracles went elsewhere. The ones who wanted patience stayed. Caleb returned one afternoon in late December carrying something wrapped in a moving blanket and tied to the side of his green Schwinn with rope. The bicycle looked too small for him by then. His wrists extended from his sleeves, and his face had begun to lose its boyish softness, though not the wary kindness around the eyes. He leaned the bike under the walnut tree, untied the blanket, and lifted out a wooden sign. It was hand-carved, uneven in the first glance and beautiful in the second. Voss and Lark, camera surface, and dog. The last words were smaller, cut beneath the old name, but not timid. The letters carried knife marks in the grooves. He had sanded the surface smooth and darkened the cuts with stain. The wood was walnut from the storm-fallen branch, seasoned near the stove and worked in shop class after his teacher agreed not to ask too many questions. Stella stood in the doorway and read the sign. Plural, she said. Caleb looked at the road. Sounds stronger. It changes the name, only adds what was already there. He had learned that from somewhere. Perhaps from his mother. Perhaps from the shop. Perhaps from watching Stella place Clara's tintype beside Evelyn's letter and leave space for those whose names had not yet been found. I do not have daughters, Stella said. Caleb lifted one shoulder. Maybe it doesn't mean that kind only. The old sign above the door remained. They did not take it down. Instead, Mr. Ruiz came with a drill. Amos Bell came to tell everyone the ladder was set wrong. Doris came with coffee, and Reverend Boyd stood on the road with his hat in his hands while Caleb fixed the carved addition beneath the existing sign, careful not to split the old wood. When it was done, the words looked as if they had been waiting for the lower board all along. Voss and Lark camera surface. And dawn. That evening, after everyone had gone and the street had settled into cold, Stella lit the saved stub of the emergency candle one final time. There was not much left of it. The flame burned low, close to the metal film canister, but it held long enough. She took out fresh paper, thick and cream-colored, bought from the stationery drawer at the bookstore down the hill. Evelyn's letter lay open beside her, not to copy, but to answer across time. Stella dipped the fountain pen, Mrs. Harrow had given her after finding it in a desk drawer at the county office, saying only that some pens prefer deeds to grocery lists. At the top of the page, Stella wrote the same opening words. My dear one, whoever you are. She stopped there for a while. There were many things she could not write yet. She did not know who would find the letter, or whether the shop would outlive wildfire. Developers, neglect, or some future fashion that made old cameras briefly valuable and therefore briefly endangered. She did not know whether the next inheritor would come from blood, friendship, apprenticeship, accident, hunger, or a classified notice nobody else bothered to read. But she knew what had to be named. The roof, the chimney, the floor, the windows, Doris's bags, Caleb's wood, Reverend Boyd's morning prayer, Mrs. Harrow's route drawn by hand, Martin Ruiz's ledger, Amos Bell's three-stroke nail, the librarian's copied map, the orange in the produce truck, Elias's screwdrivers, Marianne's silence, perhaps, but only as a fact at the edge of the road, not as the center of the story. Some absences do not deserve the largest room. She began again beneath the opening. If you have found this, then the shop has outlived my hands, and I am grateful beyond language that yours have reached it. The sentence was not perfect. She let it stand. Outside, snow began again, light and widely spaced, touching the walnut branches without weight. The repaired windows held. The stove drafted clean. The floor beneath her chair did not creak. The view camera stood in the corner with its bellows folded, its hidden compartment empty, its purpose changed from hiding to remembering. The house was patient. So was she. Years do not heal every wound by passing over it. That is a sentimental story. And old buildings know better. Water left alone becomes rot. Smoke left unvented becomes poison. A cracked pane does not mend itself because spring arrives. A person can survive and still require careful work. Stella had learned that repair was not the denial of damage. It was the slow, exact refusal to let damage have the final say. In time, people in Bisbee stopped calling it the condemned camera shop. They called it Voss and Lark. Then, after Caleb's sign had weathered one summer and one winter and the carved letters darkened under sun, some began calling it Voss and Lark and Daughters, even when they had to say the longer name slowly. The phrase found its place on envelopes, repair tags, and one little rubber stamp Stella ordered after 3 customers wrote it that way without being asked. She did not become famous. No documentary crew came. No article named her a prodigy. No distant relative arrived to claim the tools. There were months when money was still careful, when a repair took too long, when a customer argued over a price, when the roof made a sound in wind that sent her notebook open again. There were mornings when she still woke on the floor in memory before realizing she had a bed now, narrow and warm, in the clean back alcove beyond the workroom. But there were also Saturdays. On Saturdays, Stella set a towel on the bench for whoever had come to learn. White for dark parts. Dark for silver. A divided tray on the left. Empty envelopes on the right. Notebook in the middle. She made weak tea for younger hands and coffee for herself. And before anyone touched a screw, a ring, a blade, or a lens, she gave them the sentence that had outlived Elias. Before you touch, look until the thing starts telling you how it was made. The students did not always understand. That was fine. Understanding, like lime, cures slowly. The camera repair shop waits. It has always waited. And in the county clerk's office, in a narrow drawer behind Mrs. Harrow's old counter, there remains a plain white envelope marked Voss Transfer, 2022. Inside it is a photocopy of the deed, a receipt stamped paid, and one $7 entry written in blue ink with careful pressure. Mrs. Harrow retired before the next winter. But before she left, she slipped the original bills into a small archival sleeve and taped a note to the file. First payment. Do not discard. The bills are not valuable. They are worn, ordinary paper, creased from a torn jacket lining and handled at a counter on a morning when no sensible person would have called them enough. Still, they remain.